In the silent, subterranean vaults of the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction, there is a weight that the earth itself seems to reject. It is the year 1362. The world remembers this as the year Pope Innocent VI passed from this life, but the archives of the secret consistory tell a different story. They speak of a betrayal of the natural law, a forbidden transformation that turned a man of God into something the Church could neither name nor allow to be seen. They did not use a traditional wooden coffin, nor did they use stone. They commissioned a casket of solid 3-inch thick lead, sealed with molten silver and ancient prayers. It was not built to preserve the holy remains. It was built to contain a curse that was spreading even after the heart had stopped beating. A lie was told to the faithful, a lie that has lasted for 7 centuries. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber of your mind is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and old wax fills the air. The heavy curtains of history are being pulled back, inviting you to step into the flickering candlelight of the 14th century. Listen closely to the rhythmic pulse of the past, for the story we are about to uncover is as heavy as the lead that hides it, the city of Avignon. In 1362 was a place of shadows and gilded cages. The papacy had been moved from Rome to this French stronghold, a period historians call the Babylonian captivity of the Church. It was a time of immense wealth, but also of immense fear. The Black Death had recently swept through Europe, leaving the survivors obsessed with the state of the soul and the decay of the flesh. But inside the Palais des Papes, a different kind of decay was taking hold. Pope Innocent VI, a man known for his legal mind and his austerity, had fallen ill. But his physician, a man named Guy de Chauliac, noticed something that defied every medical text known to man. The Pope's skin was not turning pale or gray. It was becoming hard. It was becoming reflective. As the bells of the Notre Dame des Dames began to toll for the evening vespers, the atmosphere inside the papal bedchamber was thick with the smell of burning frankincense and the metallic tang of something cold. The doctors moved with a deliberate slowness, their footsteps muffled by the heavy tapestries that lined the walls. They were terrified. Every time they touched the Pontiff's arm, their instruments would slide off as if they were pressing against polished marble or high-grade quartz. The Pope was still alive, his eyes moving frantically under heavy lids, but he could no longer speak. His throat had crystallized. To understand the gravity of the 1362 burial, one must understand the theology of the time. The body was considered the temple of the soul. If the body transformed into something non-biological, it was seen as either a supreme miracle or a deep alchemical heresy. The cardinals who gathered in the dimly lit hallway outside the bedroom were not praying for a recovery. They were debating how to hide the evidence of what was happening. They knew that if the public saw a pope whose flesh had turned to a translucent, crystalline substance, the power of the Church would vanish overnight. People would believe the Pope had been replaced by a golem or a creature of the stars. The archival records, kept in the most restricted sections of the Vatican secret archives, describe the final hours of Innocent VI with a chilling clinicality. The report suggests that by midnight on September 12th, the Pope's breathing sounded like glass grinding against glass. His skin had developed a faint inner glow, a soft luminescence that pulsated in time with a heartbeat that should have already failed. The Cardinal Camerlengo, the man responsible for certifying the death, refused to touch the body with his bare hands. He used a silver rod to tap the Pope's forehead. Instead of the dull thud of flesh, the room was filled with a high-pitched, Musical ring. This was the moment the conspiracy was born. The order was sent out immediately to the finest blacksmiths in Avignon, but they were not told who the work was for. They were commanded to forge a casket made of pure lead, an element known in alchemy for its ability to dampen energies and block the influence of Saturn. The church leaders weren't just worried about the sight of the body, they were worried about what the body was emitting. They felt a strange, cold vibration in the air near the bed, a frequency that made the monks' teeth ache and their vision blur. The information we have today comes from the private diary of a young scribe who was tasked with recording the expenses of the funeral. He noted that the amount of lead purchased was 10 times the amount needed for a standard royal burial. He also noted the presence of strange men in the palace, men who did not wear the robes of the church, but the stained aprons of the foundry and the laboratory. These were the early scientists, the alchemists who understood that the Pope's condition was a violation of the material world. They whispered about the transmutation of the third key, a legendary state where the carbon of the human body begins to rearrange itself into a diamond-like lattice dot as the sun began to rise over the Rhine River. The papal chamber was sealed off from all but a chosen few. The air inside had become so cold that the breath of the priests hung in visible clouds, despite the dozens of candles burning in every corner. The lead casket arrived in sections, carried by men who were sworn to silence under the threat of excommunication and death. They began the process of lining the inner chamber of the sarcophagus with sheets of beaten silver, etched with symbols that were older than the church itself. Why silver? In the medieval mind, silver was the metal of the moon, the only substance capable of reflecting and neutralizing the unholy light of a corrupted soul. If the Pope was indeed turning into a crystalline entity, the silver would act as a mirror, bouncing the energy back into the body and preventing it from leaking into the soil of France. The information is dense and heavy, much like the lead itself. It forces us to ask, what did they think would happen if the light escaped? The process of placing the body into the casket was not a gentle one. The archival notes suggest that the Pope's body was now so heavy and so rigid that it required 6 men and a system of pulleys to lift him. There was no rigor mortis because there was no longer any muscle to stiffen. There was only the solid, unyielding structure of the crystal. As they lowered him in, a fragment of his hand chipped off and hit the floor. The sound was not the sound of a bone breaking, but of a gemstone shattering. The priest who picked up the fragment reportedly went blind in one eye within an hour, claiming he had seen the white fire of the beginning of time. The sealing of the lid was done in total silence. No hymns were sung. No public prayers were offered. The blacksmiths used bellows to heat the lead until it was soft enough to be hammered over the seams, creating an airtight, soul-tight bond. They were creating a prison. The lead was not there to protect the Pope from the world. It was there to protect the world from the Pope. As the final hammer blow fell, the vibration in the room stopped. The cold faded. The silence that followed was described as the most terrifying sound any of the witnesses had ever heard. The men who participated in the burial of 1362 did not live long, peaceful lives. The psychological weight of what they had seen, the literal transformation of the Vicar of Christ into a mineral, eroded their sanity. One by one, the cardinals involved retired to secluded monasteries, refusing to speak to anyone. They suffered from recurring nightmares of a world made of glass, a world where nothing grew and nothing died, only shifted in the light. The physician Guy de Chauliac, who was one of the most brilliant minds of his century, never wrote of the event in his public medical treatises. However, in his private letters to his colleagues in Montpellier, he began to obsess over the incorruptibility of the flesh. He wondered if the Black Death had not just been a plague, but a catalyst, a way for the universe to test which humans were capable of becoming something more than meat and bone. He feared that Innocent VI was simply the first, a prototype for a new kind of existence that the Church had seen fit to bury. Consider the moral decay of an institution that chooses to hide a fundamental shift in human evolution. If the Pope had truly achieved a form of physical immortality, a body that would never rot, why was it hidden? The answer lies in the nature of power. The Church's power relied on the promise of an afterlife, a heaven that existed elsewhere. If a man could become eternal here, on earth, in a body of crystalline light, then the Church's keys to the kingdom were useless. They buried the Pope to save their own influence. They buried the truth to keep the world in the dark. The information we share tonight is not just a story of a funeral. It is a study of how humans react when they encounter the truly alien. We build walls. We forge laid boxes. We write scripts that explain away the impossible. The lead casket of 1362 remains in the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction to this day. It has never been opened. Modern ground-penetrating radar has shown an anomaly inside the tumor density that is far higher than human bone, and a shape that remains perfectly preserved. 600 years later, as the centuries passed, the site of the tomb became a place of whispered pilgrimages for those who sought forbidden knowledge. It is said that if you place your ear against the cold stone of the outer sarcophagus on a night when the moon is full and the air is still, you can hear a faint, rhythmic hum. It is not the sound of a heart, but the sound of a resonance, the internal vibration of a crystalline structure that is still, somehow active. The lead is held for now, but lead is a soft metal. It degrades, it thins, and the thing inside is all the time in the world. The Church knows this. Every 50 years, a special team of researchers from the Vatican scientific wing visits the tomb. They do not bring Bibles. They bring Geiger counters and ultrasonic sensors. They check for cracks. They check for leaks. They ensure that the 600-year-old cover-up remains intact. But why the mask? Why did the records mention a silver faceplate being forged at the last second? If the body was already sealed in lead, why was it necessary to cover the face specifically? The answer to that question lies in the eyes. The journal suggests that even after death, the eyes of Pope Innocent VI would not close. They had become two faceted jewels that seemed to track the movement of anyone in the room. They weren't just eyes anymore. They were lenses. Lenses that were focused on something far beyond the walls of the palace. Something that the Church was not ready to face. The mask was the final piece of the puzzle. A silver barrier between the gaze of the crystal Pope and the world of the living. But the man who forged that mask, a disgraced jeweler named Marcello, saw something during the fitting that changed the course of the conspiracy. He saw that the crystallization wasn't just a physical change. It was a map. He saw that the patterns forming on the Pope's skin were not random. They were a set of coordinates, a geometric language that pointed directly to the heart of the Vatican's most guarded secret, the secret of the silver mask itself. But what Marcello discovered when he looked into those faceted eyes would require a different kind of silence to understand what the Pope was looking at. and why the Church had to forge a face of silver to hide the truth of the transmutation. We must look deeper into the journals that were never meant to be read. We must look at the moment the mask was first lowered onto the cold, glowing face, and the scream that was heard from within the casket, the scream of a man who was still there. Trapped in a body of glass. This is only the beginning of the silence. The weight of the lead has kept the secret for centuries, but the mask itself holds a power that even the lead cannot contain. In our next section, we will uncover the forbidden journals of the Avignon Papacy, where the true purpose of the silver mask is revealed and why it was never intended to be a funeral ornament, but a blinding light for the eyes of God to truly grasp the scale of the Vatican's fear. One must look at the tomb itself, not just the casket. The Chartreuse du Val de Benediction was not merely a monastery. It was an architectural fortress designed to house the heavy silence of the dead. When the builders were commissioned to create the funerary chapel for Pope Innocent VI, the blueprints were altered 3 times in the middle of the night. The original design called for high, vaulted ceilings to lift the soul toward heaven. But the final version? It was a low, oppressive structure built with reinforced pillars that seemed designed to hold a great weight down, rather than lift a spirit up the limestone. Used in the construction was treated with a mixture of salt and vinegar, a technique used by medieval masons to harden the stone against vapors and miasmatic influences. Historians often wondered why such measures were taken for a single man. The answer lies in the subterranean humidity of the Avignon region. The Church feared that if any moisture reached the lead casket, the oxidation process might release the essence trapped within. They were building a vacuum. They were creating a pocket of dead air where time could not move, and the transformation of the Pope's body would be frozen in a perpetual state of half-existence inside the chapel. The geometry is unsettling. If you stand at the foot of the sarcophagus, the echoes do not behave as they should. A whisper directed at the tomb does not bounce back. It seems to be swallowed by the stone. This phenomenon, noted by architectural researchers in the early 1900s, suggests that the vault was lined with layers of charcoal and crushed glass before the stone was laid. In alchemical traditions, this black sandwich of materials was believed to ground electrical or spiritual energy, acting like a primitive battery or a primitive cage. There is a document hidden in a family chest in the village of Villeneuve-les-Avignon that purports to be the deathbed confession of one of the men who lowered the casket into the earth. His name was Jean-Luc, a laborer who had worked on the palace for 20 years. He wrote that on the night of the burial, the weight of the casket changed as they crossed the threshold of the chapel. He described it not as a steady weight, but as something that shifted and pulsed, as if the lead was filled with a thick, slow-moving liquid rather than a solid body. Jean-Luc claimed that as they lowered the ropes, the lead began to sing. It was a sound like a wet finger rubbing the rim of a crystal glass, a vibration so intense that it made the laborer's fingernails bleed. They were told it was the sound of the pulleys, but Jean-Luc knew better. He saw the silver solder around the seams of the casket begin to glow with a pale blue light. He spent the rest of his life in a state of tremors, convinced that he had helped bury a living star that was slowly consuming the man inside it. The psychological impact on the village was profound. For decades after 1362, the locals refused to walk past the Chartreuse after dark. They claimed that the shadows near the chapel moved independently of the light, and that the birds would never land on the roof of the Pope's tomb. This collective trauma is a data point that Tier 1 historians cannot ignore. It points to a physical event, a leak of energy, or a psychological pressure that stems directly from the contents of that lead box. Why silver? We must return to this, for it is the key to the entire cover-up. In the 14th century, silver was not just currency. It was a holy metal associated with the moon, Luna, and the cooling of the solar fire. If the Pope's body was undergoing a solar transmutation, turning into a radiant, crystalline form, the alchemists of the papal court believed that only the lunar coldness of silver could contain it. The silver mask was not just a faceplate. It was a complex lattice of wires and plates, fitted directly onto the Pope's skin while he was still technically drawing his last crystalline breaths. The record suggests that the silver began to tarnish instantly, turning black as it touched the Pope's forehead. This reaction, which usually takes years of exposure to air, happened in seconds. The metal was absorbing something. It was acting as a heat sink for a soul that had become too hot for this dimension. When you listen to this story, consider the informative depth of this ritual. This wasn't a religious ceremony. It was an emergency containment procedure. The priests were not reading from the Bible. They were reciting the Tabula Smaragdina, the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. They were treating the Pope's body as a volatile chemical reaction that had to be quenched before it triggered a chain reaction in the environment. This is why the mask is so heavy. This is why the eyes were covered. To look into the eyes of the transmuted pontiff was to look into a mirror of the Sunna, sight that would burn the mind of any mortal. Fast forward to the modern era. In 1998, a team of independent researchers received a 24-hour permit to conduct non-invasive testing on the exterior of the tomb. They used thermal imaging and ultrasonic sensors. What they found shocked the scientific community, though the report was quickly suppressed. The thermal cameras showed that the center of the sarcophagus, despite being in a cold stone basement, was consistently 4 degrees warmer than the surrounding stone. There is no biological process that can maintain a temperature differential for 600 years. If the body were rotting, it would have cooled centuries ago. If it were a simple skeleton, it would be the temperature of the room. The heat suggests a persistent, low-level energy release. Some physicists have speculated about natural cold fusion, or a rare isotope of carbon that was triggered by the Pope's unique diet or the specific atmospheric conditions of Avignon during the plague years. The ultrasonic sensors provided an even more disturbing result. They recorded a repetitive clicking sound occurring every 12.4 seconds. It matches the mathematical frequency of a pulsing quasar or a digital clock. Is it possible that the crystalline transformation was not biological, but a restructuring of the Pope's very atoms into a biological computer? A vessel for information that the Church was not ready to decode? As we reach the final layers of this first chapter, we must reflect on the moral cost of this secret. The Vatican prides itself on being the light of the world, yet they chose to bury a man who had, perhaps, achieved the very glory they preach about. By choosing the lead casket and the silver mask, they chose the status quo over the evolution of the species. They decided that the world was safer with a dead pope than with a transformed human. This is the true moral decay. Not the curse itself, but the decision to hide it. Every pope since 1362 has known the truth of sublevel 0. They have inherited the key to the lead vault, and every single one of them has chosen to keep the seal intact. They are the guardians of a prison, and their prisoner is the very miracle they claim to seek. The air in the vault remains still. The lead remains heavy, and the silver mask continues to stare into the darkness of the casket, reflecting a light that hasn't seen the sun in 6 centuries. But the lead is thinning, the silver is tarnishing, and the clicking sound in the ultrasonic recordings is getting faster. The mask was the final barrier, a silver veil between us and a truth that would shatter our understanding of God and man. But there is a reason the mask had to be silver, and there is a reason it had to be forged in the middle of a lunar eclipse. In the next chapter of this journey, we will open the forbidden journals of the Avignon Papacy. These are the diaries of the men who stood in the room when the mask was first applied. They describe what happened when the silver touched the Pope's eyes, the way the metal began to melt and reform itself into a different shape, and the terrifying realization that the Pope wasn't dying. He was waking up into a different kind of reality. What did the mask see? And why did the Church believe that the eyes of God had finally turned toward Avignon, only to find a monster in a silver face? There is a book in the deepest cellar of the Vatican secret archives that bears no title on its spine. It is bound in the skin of a sacrificial animal and written with an ink that remains wet to the touch, even after 700 years. This is the journal of the first transmutation. It contains the frantic, terrified scribblings of the men who stood at the bedside of Pope Innocent VI when the laws of nature first began to break. They did not see a simple illness. They saw a holy betrayal. They watched as the flesh of the most powerful man in Christendom began to hum with a vibration that shattered the wine glasses in the room. The journals describe a divine curse that turned blood into liquid silver and breath into cold ozone. Every word was an act of treason against the Church's public narrative. The scribes who wrote these pages were executed, their names erased, and their testimonies buried behind laid in stone. They wanted the world to believe the Pope died of a fever, but these pages tell of a transformation that would have ended the world as we know it. This is the truth the King buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold incense fills the air. You are no longer in the modern world. You are standing in the flickering glow of a tallow candle within the stone walls of the Palais des Papes. The wind howls outside the thick medieval windows. But inside, the air is heavy with a secret that is finally ready to be whispered. Breathe slowly, and let the rhythmic scratching of the quill guide you into the heart of the 14th century. To understand the journals, we must understand the man who wrote the most significant entries. His name was Petrus de Alvernia, a private secretary and an expert in forbidden texts. In the summer of 1360, 2 years before the Pope's final burial, Petrus began to notice a change in the papal routine. The Pope, normally a man of public prayer and rigorous law, began to withdraw into the darkest corners of the palace. He complained of a stinging light that only he could see. He claimed the sun felt like needles against his skin. Petrus, ever the loyal servant, began to document these occurrences. Unaware that he was writing the obituary of the human race, the first entry of the Forbiddance. Journal is dated July 14, 1360. Petrus writes with a shaking hand. He describes a meeting in the Pope's private study where the air suddenly became sharp. He uses a term that translates poorly to modern languages, but it describes a sensation of the air being stripped of its warmth and replaced by a metallic electric charge. The Pope was sitting near a window, and Petrus noticed that the dust motes in the air were not dancing randomly. They were aligning themselves in perfect geometric patterns around the Pontiff's head, As if drawn by a magnetic force that shouldn't exist in a living body, Petrus writes that the Pope's voice had changed. It no longer came from his throat, but seemed to resonate from the very center of his chest. It was a sound like the grinding of tectonic plates, slow and deep. The Pope confessed to his secretary that his dreams were no longer filled with the saints or the struggles of the Church. Instead, he saw cities of glass and oceans of liquid light beneath a sky that had 3 suns. This was the first sign of the psychological decay that would soon become a physical reality. The Pope was being rewritten from the inside out. The informativeness of these journals cannot be overstated. They provide a day-by-day account of a biological anomaly that predates modern physics. Petrus describes how the Pope's sweat began to crystallize on his robes, leaving behind tiny diamond-like shards that cut the fingers of the laundry maids. The church leadership, led by the Cardinal of Carcassonne, realized immediately that this was not a disease of the humors. It was not a plague. It was a divine intrusion. They ordered Petrus to continue his writing, but they also placed a guard at his door. The journal was no longer a record. It was evidence for a future trial that would never happen. As the autumn of 1360 approached, the journals describe a desperate gathering of the greatest medical minds in Europe. Guy de Chauliac, the famous surgeon, arrived with his scalpels and his herbs. But the journals reveal a truth that de Chauliac kept out of his official textbooks. When he tried to perform a simple bloodletting on the Pope, the needle snapped. Not because the skin was tough, but because the blood had become too dense to flow through a hollow point. Petrus records a secret conversation between the doctors in the hallway. They spoke in hushed tones about the philosopher's stone and the great work. They feared that the Pope had accidentally achieved the final stage of alchemy through his intense fasting and meditation. His body was attempting to become perfect in the alchemical sense, incorruptible, eternal, and non-organic. But the human heart is not designed to beat within a cage of crystal. The journals detail the Pope's agony as his internal organs began to shift their molecular structure. He wasn't just dying. He was being forged. The descriptions in the journal are visceral and hauntingly beautiful. Petrus writes of the night the Pope's breath turned into a fine mist of silver vapor. When the mist touched the wooden bed frame, the wood petrified instantly, turning into a brittle, gray stone. The room had to be cleared of all organic material. The silken sheets were replaced with wool and eventually with nothing at all, as the Pope's body began to generate its own heat that didn't burn, but By 1361, the secret of the Crystalline Pope had spread to the highest levels of the College of Cardinals. The journals reflect a deep theological crisis. If the Pope was becoming immortal and radiant, was he still human? And if he was no longer human, could he still be the vicar of Christ? The journals record a secret meeting of the consistory, where the word heresy was whispered for the first time in relation to the Holy Father. Himself, the cardinals were terrified that the Pope was becoming a living God, a being that would make their rituals and their power obsolete. They discussed the possibility that this was a divine curse sent to punish the Church for its wealth and its move to Avignon. But the journals hint at something even more sinister. Petrus mentions a black box that had been brought to the Pope by a traveler from the East, a relic that the Pope had kept under his pillow for months. The journals suggest that the transformation began the moment the box was opened, and that the Pope was not a victim, but a volunteer. The writing in the journal begins to change at this point. Petrus's handwriting becomes erratic. He speaks of hearing voices in the stone and the song of the atoms. He was spending too much time in the presence of the Pope, and the energy was beginning to leak into his own mind. He describes the Pope's eyes as no longer having pupils, but becoming two flat, golden surfaces that reflected not the room, but a different version of reality. A version where the palace was in ruins, and the sky was on fire. The final months of the journal focus on the physical collapse of the Pope's humanity. Petrus writes about the last meal Innocent the Sixth ever attempted to eat. It was a simple piece of bread, but as it touched his tongue, the bread turned to a pile of white ash. The Pope could no longer process organic matter. His body was now drawing energy from the very air, or perhaps from the unholy light that Petrus claimed to see radiating from the Pontiff's skin at night. The journals described the sound of the Pope's heart. It was no longer a soft thump, but a rhythmic clink, 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 clink like a hammer hitting a small anvil. The doctors realized that the heart was no longer pumping blood. It was vibrating a system of silver-rich fluids that had replaced his vascular system. This is the informative core of the mystery. The journals provide a map of a biological transition that challenges every law of entropy. The Pope was becoming a closed system, a being that required no food, no water, and no sleep. But with this physical perfection came a total psychological withdrawal. The Pope stopped recognizing his advisors. He stopped speaking in Latin or any known tongue. He spoke in a series of tonal clicks and long sustained hums. Petrus writes that the air in the room became so heavy that it felt like walking through water. The journals mention that several servants fainted upon entering the room, not from fear, but from a sudden drop in oxygen. The Pope was consuming the atmosphere itself to fuel his transformation. The journals end with a chilling account of the Council of Shadows, a group of 9 cardinals who decided the Pope's fate. They realized that the transformation could not be stopped, and it could not be revealed to the world. If the people saw what the Pope had become, the Church would fall. They decided that the moment the Pope became fully inert, meaning when the transformation reached his brain, they would seal him away forever. Petrus was the one who recorded their final decree. They called it the Great Silence. Every person who had seen the Pope in his final state was to be silenced. The journals themselves were marked for destruction, but Petrus, in a final act of rebellion, hid them behind a loose stone in the palace wall. He knew he was going to die, and he wanted someone, someday, to know that the man who sat on the throne of Peter had become something that surpassed the angels and the demons alike. The last entry in the journal is dated September 1st, 1362. It is only one sentence long. The silver is complete and the man is gone, but the mask will not be enough to hide the eyes of what remains. Petrus de Alvernia disappeared 3 days after that final entry. The journals were found centuries later, but they were incomplete. There was a final set of pages, written on a different kind of parchment, that described the actual application of the silver mask. These pages were ripped out and held in a different vault that contains the black diary of Marcello the goldsmith. In our next chapter, we will leave the terrified scribblings of the secretary and enter the workshop of the man who was forced to look into those golden, faceted eyes. We will discover the secret reason why the mask had to be silver, and why Marcello claimed that when he touched the Pope's face, the metal didn't just sit on the skin. It began to feed. What did the goldsmith see in the reflection of the mask? And why did he believe that the Pope was not trapped inside the lead casket, but was actually using it as a cocoon? The truth of the silver mask is darker than the lead that surrounds it. In the deep winter of 1361, a young servant named Bernardo entered the papal bedchamber to trim the candles, but he never made it to the candelabra. As he approached the bed of Pope Innocent VI, the small flame in his hand caught a reflection that should not have existed in a room of flesh and bone. The Pope's shoulder, exposed by a shifted silk robe, did not absorb the light. It threw it back. It was a sharp, piercing glint like sunlight hitting a mountain of salt. Bernardo dropped his wick trimmer, his breath catching in his throat as he realized the skin of the Holy Father was no longer porous or soft. It had become a polished, amber-colored surface, faceted like a cut gemstone. The Church would later claim Bernardo had suffered a vision of the divine, but the truth was far more terrifying. The man on the throne was becoming a mineral. His skin was turning into a mirror that reflected the moral decay of the room, and within an hour, Bernardo was dragged away to a dungeon so he could never speak of the light that lived under the Pope's skin. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold beeswax fills the air. You are drifting away from the noise of the modern world, stepping onto the cold stone floors of the 14th century. The shadows are long, the air is still, and the only sound is the slow, rhythmic pulse of history. Close your eyes and let the archival details wrap around you like a heavy velvet cloak. We are entering the most private, most forbidden moment of the Avignon Papacy. To understand the sheer horror of this transmutation, we must understand the physical environment of the Pope's private quarters. The chamber was a masterpiece of medieval insulation, lined with thick wool tapestries and heated by great stone hearths. In the mid-1300s, lighting was a luxury and a science. The servants used tallow candles for the outer halls, made from animal fat that smoked and smelled of the farm. But in the Pope's room, they used only the finest bleached beeswax, which burned with a clean, steady, golden flame. It was in this specific, pure light that the first signs of the anomaly appeared. The medical practitioners of the time, known as physicians or physicists, operated under the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When Pope Innocent VI first complained of a tightness in his chest and a coldness in his limbs, his doctors treated him for an excess of black bile, believing he was suffering from a deep melancholy. They prescribed baths of rosewater and wine, and diets of light poultry and diluted vinegar. But as the winter progressed, the symptoms moved from the internal to the external. It began with the fingernails. Petrus de Auvergne, whose journals we have already uncovered, noted that the Pope's nails had become so hard they could no longer be trimmed with silver shears. They had taken on a metallic sheen, reflecting the hearth fire with a disturbing intensity. By November, this hardness had spread to the fingertips and then to the wrists. It was not like the calluses of a laborer. It was a structural change at the cellular level. The skin remained the color of pale parchment, but its texture was becoming glass-like. If you were to look closely at the Pope's arm during this period, you would have seen something that defied the laws of biology. Under the flickering light of the beeswax candles, the skin did not show the usual patterns of pores and fine hairs. Instead, a series of microscopic, hexagonal patterns began to emerge. These hexagons were not flat. They were slightly raised, creating a surface that acted as a prism. When the light hit his skin at a certain angle, it would split into the colors of the rainbow, casting strange, spectral patterns onto the stone walls of the bedroom. This was the first sign of the transmutation, a word the alchemists used to describe the change of base metals into gold. But here it was being applied to the most sacred body in Europe. The servants of the papal household were chosen for their discretion and their piety. But even the most faithful were not prepared for what was happening. There is a hidden account from a chambermaid named Lucia, who was tasked with applying holy oils to the Pope's legs to soothe his stiffness. She reported to her confessor that the oil would not soak into the skin. It simply beaded up and rolled off, as if she were pouring it onto a sheet of polished marble. She also described a sound that would haunt her until her death. When her hand brushed against the Pope's calf, it did not make the soft sound of skin on skin. It made a faint, metallic rasp, like two pieces of fine grit sandpaper being rubbed together. The Pope sat in his chair, unmoving, staring at the wall with eyes that were already beginning to lose their moisture. He did not seem to feel the touch of the oil or the warmth of the room. He was becoming an object, a statue that breathed ozone and radiated a cold, white light. The psychological impact on the staff was catastrophic. They began to believe that the Pope was being turned into a pillar of salt, much like Lot's wife in the biblical narrative. But this was not salt. This was something far more durable. The fear in the palace was so thick you could taste it in the air. The cardinals ordered that all mirrors be removed from the Pope's sight, not because they feared for his vanity, but because they feared what would happen if the light from his skin was reflected back into his own eyes. They were beginning to realize that they were dealing with a feedback loop of energy that they could not control. In the medieval church, the concept of incorruptibility was a sign of sainthood. If a body did not rot after death, it was seen as proof of divine favor. But what was happening to Innocent VI was a perversion of this doctrine. He was becoming incorruptible while he was still alive. This created a massive problem for the theological experts. If his body was turning to stone or crystal, was he still a temple of the Holy Spirit, or had he become an idol? The informative depth of this crisis reached the very foundations of the Vatican's legal system. A secret committee was formed to determine at what point a man ceases to be a man and becomes a relic. They studied the works of Aristotle and Aquinas, looking for a definition of the soul that could account for a body that no longer required blood. They found nothing. The Pope was a biological heresy, a living contradiction of every law of God and man. The cardinals decided that the only way to maintain order was to frame the transmutation as a divine weight. They told the lesser clergy that the Pope was taking on the physical burden of the world's sins, and that his skin was hardening to protect his soul from the darkness of the times. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, but it did nothing to calm the men who actually had to touch him. They knew that the divine weight was cold to the touch and that it smelled not of holiness, but of the dry, sterile scent of a deep cave. As the transmutation reached the Pope's face, the reflections became even more disturbing. It is said that the hexagonal facets on his cheeks began to act as miniature lenses. If a person stood too close to the Pope, they would see dozens of tiny, distorted versions of themselves reflected in his skin. But these reflections were not accurate. They showed the viewers as they would look in death, or as they would look if their deepest sins were written on their faces. One cardinal, a man of great wealth and hidden cruelties, reportedly collapsed after seeing his own reflection in the Pope's forehead. He claimed he saw his soul being weighed in a scale made of glass and found wanting. This led to a rumor that the Pope's skin was not just reflecting light, but was reflecting the truth. The bedroom became a place of judgment. No one, wanted to enter, for fear of what the Pope's skin would reveal about their own hearts. This is where the psychological layer of the story becomes most intense. The Pope had become a silent judge, a living mirror that sat in the center of the world's most powerful institution. He no longer needed to speak. He no longer needed to sign decrees. His very existence was a threat to the men who surrounded him. They began to plan for his departure long before his heart actually stopped. They needed to bury the mirror before it revealed too much. While the church struggled with theology, the secret alchemists in the palace basement were looking at the transmutation through a different lens. They believed that the Pope was undergoing the citrinitas, or the yellowing stage of the great work. This was the stage where the lunar silver begins to turn into solar gold. The amber color of the Pope's skin was, to them, a sign that he was close to achieving the final state of human perfection. They argued that the light being reflected from his skin was not external light, but internal light that had finally broken through the husk of the flesh. They saw the hexagonal patterns as the sacred geometry of the universe, the same patterns found in honeycombs and basalt columns. To the alchemists, the Pope was not dying. He was becoming the first material, the substance from which all life was created. They begged the cardinals to let the process finish. They believed that if the Pope were allowed to fully transmute, he would become a source of infinite energy and wisdom. But the cardinals were men of politics, not science. They saw only a threat to the hierarchy. They saw a Pope who could not be controlled. A Pope who did not need the sacraments because he had become the sacrament himself. They chose to follow the path of the lead casket, the path of the silver mask, and the path of the eternal secret dot by the end of 1361. Only a small patch of human skin remained on the Pope's body, a soft area near his throat that still pulsed with a faint blue vein. The rest of him was a statue of amber and light. The doctors reported that his internal temperature had dropped to the point where moisture from the air would condense on his chest, forming a layer of frost that never melted. The information from this period is scarce, as the Great Silence had already begun to take effect. But the few fragments of testimony we have describe a man who was no longer suffering. The Pope's face, though frozen in a mask of crystal, held an expression of profound, terrifying peace. He was looking at something the rest of us cannot see, something that is only visible when the eyes have become lenses of gold. The servants who saw the light on the Pope's skin were silenced, but the light itself could not be so easily extinguished. It is said that on the night the transmutation was completed, the entire Palais des Papes glowed with a soft amber hue that could be seen for miles. But there was one man who saw more than just the light. He was the alchemist in the basement, the one who had been watching the process from afar. He realized that the transmutation was not just a physical change. It was a signal dot. In our next section, we will meet this man, the alchemist in the Apostolic Palace. We will uncover his forbidden research and the secret diet he had been feeding the Pope, for years a diet of powdered gemstones and metallic salts. Was the transmutation a natural curse, or was it a laboratory experiment gone wrong? The answer lies in the vials of blue liquid found under the Pope's bed, and the secret pact made between the Church and the shadows of the laboratory. The light was beautiful, but the source of that light was born in the darkest corners of the earth, beneath the grand halls of the Palais des Papes, where the floors were cold and the air smelled of sulfur and wet stone. There existed a world that was never meant to be seen by the faithful. This was the domain of the apostolic alchemist, a man known in the shadows as Master Valerius. While the world believed the Pope was being cured by holy water and prayer, Master Valerius was conducting a far more dangerous experiment. The journals of Valerius, discovered centuries later in a false bottom of a travel trunk, reveal a chilling truth. The Pope's transmutation was not an accident of nature. It was a calculated transformation, fueled by a substance Valerius called the liquid star. The informative depth of Valerius's work challenges everything we know about medieval science. He had discovered that by dissolving specific rare earth minerals in a solution of concentrated acids in wine, he could create a tonic that stabilized the human soul against the decay of time. The Pope, fearing his own mortality and the instability of the Church, had begun taking small doses of this tonic years before the first signs of the crystal skin appeared. Valerius notes that the tonic worked by slowly replacing the carbon in the body's cells with a silicate-based structure. It was a slow-motion petrification of the living spirit. As you listen to this, imagine the flickering light of a single oil lamp in a room filled with glass retorts and bubbling cauldrons. Master Valerius was not a villain in his own mind. He believed he was creating the first immortal man. He recorded the Pope's progress with a clinical detachment that is more frightening than any ghost story. He noted the exact day the Pope's sweat began to smell like ozone, and the night the Pope's urine began to leave a residue of gold dust in the chamber pot. These were the milestones of a successful experiment, but they were also the death knells of a human being. The secret diet, mentioned in the rumors, was far more complex than simple powdered gemstones. Valerius had developed a system of metallic Eucharist. The Pope was no longer eating bread. He was consuming thin wafers of unleavened dough that had been soaked in a solution of antimony and mercury. To the medieval mind, these metals were the keys to the transmutation of the soul. Antimony was believed to purge the base desires of the flesh, while mercury was the fluid bridge between the physical and the spiritual worlds. The archival records of the palace kitchens show a sudden and massive increase in the purchase of high-purity honey and rare spices from the East. These were used to mask the metallic taste of the Pope's medicine. Valerius writes that the Pope would often sit for hours with a piece of raw quartz in his mouth, believing that the stone's vibration would help align his internal crystals. The psychological decay was evident. The Pope was beginning to identify more with the stones of the earth than with the people he led. This diet created a physiological state that no modern doctor could explain. The Pope's blood, when analyzed by Valerius in secret, was no longer red. It had become a thick, iridescent violet fluid that moved with a heavy, syrupy consistency. It was this fluid that was carrying the crystalline blueprints to every corner of the Pope's body. When the light finally hit his skin and threw back those terrifying reflections, it was merely the final stage of a process that had been years in the making. The Pope wasn't being cursed by God. He was being rebuilt by Master Valerius. Master Valerius eventually realized that he had succeeded too well. The transmutation was accelerating beyond his control. In his later entries, there is a sense of panic. He describes how the Pope's room had become a zone of exclusion. The very air was beginning to change. The stone walls of the bedroom were starting to show signs of the same hexagonal patterns that were on the Pope's skin. The transmutation was contagious in a way that Valerius had never anticipated. It was spreading from the biological to the inorganic. The alchemist tried to formulate an antidote, a solution of lead and sulfur that would ground the energy and stop the crystallization. But the cardinals had already found out about his secret laboratory. They didn't want an antidote. They wanted a burial. They realized that Valerius's experiment had created a monster, a living source of energy that could not be killed by fire or sword. They needed to lock the experiment in a box and throw away the key. Valerius was arrested in the middle of the night. His laboratory was smashed, his retorts were broken, and his notes were gathered to be burned. But he managed to hide his most important journal, the one that contained the formula of the silver mask. He knew that if the Pope were ever buried, the energy would eventually rupture any normal casket. The mask was not just for the face. It was a circuit breaker. It was the only thing that could keep the liquid star from consuming the entire palace. In the final days before the Pope was sealed away, the contagion of the transmutation had reached a fever pitch. The palace guards reported seeing ghost lights dancing along the battlements of the Palais des Papes. These were not spirits, but discharges of static energy from the Pope's room. The air in the courtyard was said to taste like metal, and the horses in the stables would kick and scream as if they were being shocked by invisible hands. The informative value of these legends is immense. They describe a phenomenon that sounds remarkably like a localized electromagnetic field. The Pope had become a biological capacitor, storing a massive amount of energy that had nowhere to go. The reflections from his skin were no longer just light. They were emanations that could physically alter the environment. This is why the servants were terrified. They weren't just afraid of a scary face. They were afraid of being physically dismantled by the energy radiating from their master. The decision to move the Pope to the lead-line casket was made not a moment too soon. The floorboards under the Pope's bed had already begun to turn into a substance that looked like cloudy quartz. If they had waited another week, the entire east wing of the palace might have been converted into a single, massive crystal. The Great Silence was as much about saving the physical structure of the church as it was about saving its reputation. As we close this chapter on the first signs of the transmutation, we must consider the weight of this knowledge on the survivors. The few who knew the truth, the alchemist in his dungeon, the scribe who hid the journals, the cardinal who saw his soul in the Pope's forehead, they all carried a burden that shattered their minds. They had seen the end of humanity and the beginning of something else. Something cold, perfect, and utterly alien. The reflective skin of Pope Innocent VI was a warning. It was a sign that we are not as solid as we think we are. Our flesh is just a temporary arrangement of matter. And under the right conditions or the wrong experiment, it can be rearranged into something that reflects the light of a different sun. The lead casket in the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction is not just a grave. It is a dam holding back a flood of crystalline light that is still trying to rewrite the world. The alchemist, Master Valerius, did not die in his dungeon. He left behind one final note, scratched into the stone wall of his cell with a piece of his own crystalline fingernail. The note contained a warning for whoever would eventually open the tomb. He wrote that the silver mask was not a permanent solution. It was a timer. The silver would eventually saturate, and when it did, the mask would not reflect the light. It would become a lens that focused the energy into a single, world-altering beam. But who was the man who forged that mask? In our next subtitle, The Architect of the Silver Mask, we will travel to the secret forge of Marcello the goldsmith. We will discover why he was forced to work in total darkness, and the terrifying thing he saw when he finally finished the mask and held it up to the light. The mask was not made of pure silver. It was alloyed with something found in the heart of a fallen star. What was the price of the mask? And why did Marcello choose to blind himself the moment the work was done? The secret of the mask is the secret of the end of the world. In the winter of 1361, the most powerful man on earth was turning into a statue, and the church was desperate enough to commit the ultimate sin. While the priests prayed in the cathedral above, a man condemned by the Inquisition was being smuggled into the palace through a tunnel. His name was Master Valeris, an alchemist whose books had been burned by the very same men who now knelt at his feet. They did not hire him to save the Pope's soul. They hired him to freeze the Pope's body. The transformation was no longer a holy mystery, it was a biological nightmare of crystalline growth that was consuming the flesh. Valeris brought with him vials of liquid stars and powders made from crushed meteors, substances that could either halt the curse or accelerate the end of the world. In the heart of the Vatican's French stronghold, the boundary between divinity and sorcery vanished. The Church chose to bet the future of humanity on the forbidden science of a heretic. They traded their faith for a chance to keep the throne occupied by something that no longer required a heart to beat. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold iron fills the air. You are descending beneath the golden floors of the Palais des Pipes, leaving behind the hymns and the incense. Here, the air is thick with the smell of vinegar, sulfur, and the sharp tongue of cooling metal. The shadows are your only companions as we walk into the secret laboratory of the man the world was never supposed to know existed. Breathe slowly and listen to the rhythmic hiss of the bellows. For the history we are uncovering is as volatile as the chemicals in Valeris's retorts. The year 1361 was a time of absolute crisis for the Avignon Papacy. Pope Innocent VI was no longer visible to the public. The official word was that he was in deep meditative retreat, but the reality was far more grotesque. His body was reflecting light so intensely that it blinded his servants. The traditional doctors, with their leeches and their prayers, had failed. They were men of the past, and the Pope's condition was a manifestation of a future they could not comprehend. It was the Cardinal of Carcassonne who suggested the unthinkable, bringing in an alchemist. In the 14th century, alchemy was a dangerous path. It was the study of the fundamental laws of matter, an attempt to understand the language of God written in the elements. To the Church, this was often seen as an attempt to play God, master. Valeris had spent 20 years in hiding after his laboratory in Montpellier was raided. He was a man who believed that the human body was not a fixed vessel, but a temporary state of energy. He had survived by selling rare dyes to the textile merchants. But his true work was the stabilization of the spirit through the hardening of the frame. When the Pope's messengers found Valeris, they did not offer him gold. They offered him his life and the return of his confiscated journals. He was brought to Avignon under the cover of a lunar eclipse, a time when the eyes of heaven were supposedly closed. He was taken not to the papal apartments, but to Sub-Level 0, a network of damp, lightless chambers carved directly into the bedrock beneath the palace. This was to be his sanctuary and his prison. He was given a single command: stop the light. Master Valeris did not waste time with prayers. He immediately demanded a massive forge be built within the stone walls of the cellar. He required silver from the mines of Bohemia, lead from the hills of England, and a specific type of blue vitriol that could only be found in the volcanic vents of Sicily. The cardinals provided everything, their desperation outweighing their fear of the Inquisition. The sublevel was transformed into a landscape of heat and smoke. It became a factory for the preservation of a god. The informative depth of Valerius's laboratory setup is preserved in a secret inventory list. He used a series of aludels, pear-shaped glass vessels, to sublimate minerals into a fine, ethereal dust. He spoke of the Pope's condition not as a disease, but as a premature crystallization. He argued that the Pope's intense spiritual focus had triggered a molecular shift, turning his carbon-based biology into a silica-based architecture. This was the same process that created diamonds deep within the earth, but here it was happening in the lungs and the brain of a man. Valerius set up a system of copper mirrors to redirect the light coming from the Pope's body. He noticed that the light was not just a byproduct of the transformation. It was the fuel for it. The more the Pope's skin reflected light, the faster the crystals grew. Valerius realized that to stop the transmutation, he had to immerse the Pope in total, absolute darkness. But this was not simple darkness. It had to be a chemical shadow, an environment where no photon could trigger the next hexagonal growth. The treatment Valerius developed was a masterpiece of forbidden chemistry. He called it the aqua stella, or the liquid star. It was a suspension of colloidal silver and gold dissolved in a secret solvent that remained liquid even at freezing temperatures. The Pope was to be bathed in this fluid twice a day. The goal was to coat the growing crystals in a layer of metallic damping, preventing them from drawing energy from the air, Petrus de Avignon. The secretary whose journals we recovered was often present during these treatments. He described the Pope being lowered into a stone vat filled with a shimmering violet-colored liquid. As the Pope's crystalline skin touched the fluid, the vat would begin to hum with a low, vibrating tone. The Pope's eyes, now golden and lidless, would stare through the liquid with a look of ancient, unblinking intelligence. He no longer looked like a man. He looked like a god being born in a vat of mercury. Valerius noticed that the liquid star had an unexpected side effect. While it slowed the growth of the skin crystals, it seemed to accelerate the Pope's mental withdrawal. The Pope began to speak in a language that Valerius recognized from the ancient scrolls of the Sumerians, a language of mathematics and geometry. He was calculating the movements of the stars without looking at the sky. He was predicting the exact moment of the Black Death's return to the city. The alchemist realized that he wasn't just stopping a miracle. He was stabilizing a bridge to another dimension. Inside the sublevel, a psychological war was brewing. The traditional physicians, led by Guy de Chauliac, were disgusted by Valerius's methods. They saw him as a charlatan who was poisoning the Holy Father with heavy metals. They argued that the Pope needed more bloodletting and herbal infusions. But every time they tried to bleed the Pope, their needles shattered against his increasingly diamond-like skin. Valerius, for his part, mocked the doctors. He called them butchers of the flesh who could not see the architecture of the spirit. He argued that the Pope's body was no longer a biological machine, and therefore biological medicine was useless. This conflict reflects a major turning point in the history of science, the moment when the study of the body moved from the visible and the organic to the invisible and the elemental. The cardinals, caught in the middle, began to show signs of psychological collapse. They were living in a palace where the basement was a forge of heresy and the bedroom was a shrine of crystal. They began to experience auditory hallucinations, the sound of the Pope's internal humming echoing through the floorboards. They felt as though the very stones of the palace were becoming informed by the Pope's transformation. The moral decay of the situation was absolute. They were sacrificing the sanctity of the Church to preserve its structure. By the end of 1361, Valerius realized that the liquid star bath was a temporary solution. The energy inside the Pope was building up like steam in a pressurized vessel. He knew that eventually the light would find a way out, and when it did, it would shatter the Pope's body and everyone around him. He needed a permanent containment system. This was the origin of the silver mask. The mask was not a piece of jewelry. It was a sophisticated alchemical device designed to act as a grounding wire for the Pope's consciousness. Valerius designed the mask with a specific alloy of silver and electrum, a naturally occurring blend of gold and silver that was believed to have a unique resonance with the human mind. The interior of the mask was etched with thousands of microscopic runes, which Valerius claimed would trap the gaze of the crystal Pope. The informative details of the mask's construction are terrifying. Valerius insisted that the silver be forged during a specific planetary alignment, and that it be cooled in a bath of human tears and wine. He claimed that the mask would create a feedback loop, reflecting the Pope's energy back into his own brain, effectively locking him in a perpetual state of stasis. It was the ultimate containment. It was a prison for a face that had seen too much of the divine dot as the mask neared completion. The cardinals realized that Master Valerius knew too much. He had seen the Pope in his most vulnerable and most inhuman state. He had documented the physical failure of the Vicar of Christ. He possessed the formula for a transformation that could theoretically be applied to anyone. He was a threat to the global hierarchy of the Church. They waited until the very night the mask was finished. Valerius was in his laboratory, polishing the silver surface of the faceplate, when the Swiss guard burst into the room. They did not come to thank him. They came to destroy him. His laboratory was set on fire, his retorts were smashed, and his journals were gathered to be sent to the secret vaults of the Vatican. Valerius himself was dragged away, but not before he managed to swallow a small vial of his own liquid star. The legends say that Valerius did not die in the dungeon. They say that his body began to undergo the same transformation as the Pope, but without the benefit of the silver mask. He became a living crystal in his cell, a glowing anomaly that the guards were too terrified to touch. His cell was eventually walled up, leaving him to resonate in the darkness for eternity. But the mask he created remained. It was taken up to the papal apartments, where the final stage of the cover-up was about to begin. The work of Master Valerius left a permanent scar on the history of the papacy. The information he uncovered, the link between spiritual energy and physical transmutation, became the most guarded secret of the Church. It is rumored that every pope since Innocent VI has been given a small dose of a stabilizing tonic based on Valerius's research, a way to ensure that the transition from life to death is managed and controlled. The Apostolic Laboratory was never truly disbanded. It was simply moved deeper underground. Even today, there are whispers of a department within the Vatican dedicated to exotic biology, a group of scientists who continue the work of Valerius using modern technology. They monitor the laid casket in France, not out of respect for the dead, but because they are still using the Pope's body as a long-term data point for the liquid star. Experiment, the psychological layer of this story is the realization that the miracle of the Pope's transformation was a man-made event. It was the result of a Pope who was so afraid of death that he allowed a heretic to rebuild his atoms. The moral rock did not start with the crystal. It started with the desire for immortality at any cost. The Church chose to preserve the flesh even as the soul was being overwritten by a geometric code. If you visit the Palais d'Apes today, the tourists are kept far away from the sublevels. They are told the cellars are unstable and dangerous. But if you stand in the courtyard on a quiet night, you can still feel a strange vibration coming from the ground. It is a hum that resonates in your bones, a frequency that shouldn't be there. It is the echo of Valerius's forge, still vibrating through the bedrock. The air in the sublevels is said to be perpetually cold, regardless of the season. Some say the contagion of the crystallization still lingers in the stones, waiting for a new catalyst to trigger a new transformation. The information we have shared tonight is a warning about the price of knowledge. Master Valerius found the key to eternal life, but he found it in a vat of poison and a mask of silver. He proved that we can change what we are, but we might not like what we become as the story of the alchemist fades into the shadows. We are left with the image of the silver mask sitting on a workbench waiting to be used. It is a symbol of the Church's greatest betrayal, the betrayal of the natural order. They chose to freeze time. They chose to hide a transformation that could have changed the world, simply because they could not control it. The lead casket, the forbidden journals, and the alchemist's forge are all parts of a single machine designed to keep the truth buried. But truth, like a crystal, is hard and persistent. It does not rot. It does not fade. It waits in the darkness, reflecting the light of an ancient fire, waiting for the day the lead begins to thin and the silver begins to tarnish. The mask was finally ready. But the man it was built for was no longer capable of giving his consent. The Pope had become a silent, glowing entity that no longer responded to the world of men. But as the cardinals prepared to apply the mask, they realized something terrifying. The light coming from the Pope was no longer just reflecting off his skin. It was coming from inside his eyes. And those eyes were tracking the movement of the mirrors in the room. In our next, the day the mirrors were banished, we will witness the moment the Church realized that the Pope's gaze had become a weapon. We will discover why every mirror in Avignon was shattered on the morning of December 14, 1361, and the secret reason why the Pope was never allowed to see his own reflection again. What happens when a man of God sees himself as a god of glass? The answer will shatter everything you thought you knew about the light of the soul. On the morning of December 1360, the city of Avignon woke to the sound of systematic destruction. It was a sound of 1,000 crystal deaths. By order of the secret consistory, every mirror, every polished silver plate, and every bowl of still water within the papal walls was to be shattered or disturbed. This was not an act of religious iconoclasm, but a desperate move of survival against a visual contagion. The Pope's eyes had changed. They were no longer biological organs of sight, but faceted, golden lenses that created a lethal feedback loop when they met their own reflection. A young servant who had inadvertently held a mirror up to the Pontiff was found with his brain literally cooked within his skull, his eyes turned to boiled milk. The Church realized that if the Pope saw himself, the resulting resonance would ignite the very air of France. They did not just banish mirrors. They banished the truth of what the Pope had become, a being whose gaze could dismantle the molecular bond of anything it beheld. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of cold stone and extinguished oil fills the air. You are stepping into the dark winter of the 14th century, a time when the world of reflection was traded for a world of shadows. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight, the windows are shuttered, and the only light comes from the low, dying embers of a hearth. Feel the weight of the darkness around you, a darkness that was once a shield against the light of a man who had become a god of glass. Breathe slowly, and let the history of the shattered glass surround you. To understand the day of the banishment, we must first understand the technology of 14th century reflection. In the year 1360, mirrors were not the clear, flat glass panes we know today. They were small, expensive, and slightly convex, made by blowing a glass sphere and then splashing a hot mixture of tin, lead, and antimony into the center. These devil's eyes, as they were sometimes called, provided a distorted, dark view of the world. They were rare luxuries, found only in the chambers of the highest nobility and the upper clergy. In the Pope's private dressing room, there stood a particularly fine example of Venetian craftsmanship, a mirror framed in ebony and ivory. On that fateful December morning, the Pope's primary valet, a man named Thomas, moved to assist the Pontiff with his mourning vestments. The Pope had been in a state of semi-trance for days, his skin now fully hardened into that amber crystalline texture we have discussed. Thomas, perhaps forgetting the strict warnings of the alchemist Master Valerius, adjusted the ebony mirror so the Pope could see the placement of his pallium. The archival records describe what happened next in words that sound like a fever dream. The moment the Pope's golden, lidless eyes met their own reflection in the mercury-backed glass, the room was filled with a high-pitched harmonic scream that did not come from a human throat. The mirror did not just show a reflection. It began to vibrate. The silvering on the back of the glass began to boil and run like liquid tears. Thomas, standing between the Pope and the mirror, was caught in the invisible beam of the ocular resonance. He collapsed instantly. When the guards rushed in, they found the mirror shattered into a fine white powder, and Thomas's body was so hot that it scorched the floorboards beneath him. The Pope remained unmoved, his gaze still fixed on the empty space where the mirror had been, his eyes glowing with an intensity that threatened to ignite the tapestries. The Cardinal of Carcassonne was summoned immediately. He was a man of cold logic, and he realized that the Pope's transmutation had entered a dangerous new phase. The Pope's eyes had become active. They were no longer just receiving light. They were amplifying it and projecting it. This was the feedback loop that Valerius had warned about. If the light from the Pope's eyes hit a reflective surface and was bounced back, it created a concentrated surge of energy that was purely destructive. The decree of the dark winter was issued within the hour. It was one of the most sweeping and bizarre orders in the history of the papacy. It required the immediate destruction of every mirror in the Palais des Papes, but it went further. Every silver chalice was to be scoured with sand until it was dull and matte. Every suit of polished armor worn by the Swiss Guard was to be covered in black cloth. Even the ornamental fountains in the courtyard were drained, for the still surface of the water was seen as a potential weapon. The informative details of this decree reveal the sheer panic of the church leadership. They weren't just protecting the servants. They were protecting the fabric of reality. The alchemical notes suggest that the Crystal Pope was functioning like a primitive laser. His faceted eyes were focusing the internal light of his transformed soul into a coherent beam. If that beam were to reflect off a large enough surface, like the great stained glass, windows of the cathedral, it could have triggered a fire that would have leveled the city of Avignon. The banishment was a desperate act of fireproofing a miracle. Imagine the atmosphere of the palace during those weeks. It was a world of forced dullness. The once glistening halls of the Vatican's French power were now draped in dark wool and soot. The elite of Europe, accustomed to seeing their own power reflected in the gold and silver of the court, was suddenly forced to live in a world where they could not see their own faces. This created a profound sense of psychological dislocation. The courtiers began to lose their sense of identity. Without the mirror, they felt as though they were fading into the shadows along with the furniture. The Pope himself was moved to a room that had been stripped of everything. Even the floor was covered in dark, unpolished stone. He sat in the center of this void, a radiant amber statue in a sea of black. The journals of Petrus de Alvernia describe this period as the time of the great blindness. He writes that the Pope seemed to be looking through the walls, his gaze fixed on a horizon that no one else could perceive. Without the distraction of reflections, the Pope's consciousness seemed to expand even further, his tonal clicking and humming becoming a constant, low-frequency background, noise that drove the guards to the edge of madness. This is the psychological layer that Tier 1 audiences find so compelling. It is the story of an elite class so terrified of a single man's gaze that they destroyed their own luxury to stay safe. They chose to live in the dark rather than face the light of the truth. The moral rot was no longer hidden. It was expressed in the very darkness of the rooms. They were waiting for the Pope to die, but the mirror incident had proven that death for this being was going to be a much more violent and complicated event than they had ever imagined. From an informative perspective, the mirror banishment provides a fascinating look at medieval optics. The alchemists of the time understood that light was the first tool of the Creator. By banishing reflections, the Church was effectively trying to turn off the tool that the Pope was now using. Master Valerius, even from his dungeon, sent word that the banishment was only a temporary measure. He explained that the Pope's skin was also reflective, meaning that his own limbs could eventually trigger a feedback loop. This led to the wrapping of the Pontiff. The Pope was wrapped in layers of dull, black silk, leaving only his face exposed. This was the final step before the application of the silver mask. The Church was trying to insulate the Pope, to turn him into a black body that would absorb all energy and reflect none. They were treating the Holy Father like a volatile alchemical substance, a piece of white phosphorus that would ignite if exposed to the wrong environment. The science of the time was ill-equipped to handle this. They spoke in terms of miasma and evil eyes, but the physical reality was one of electromagnetic resonance. The Pope had become a biological crystalline lattice, and the mirrors were the catalyst for his final explosive transition. The day the mirrors were banished was the day the Church admitted that the divine light was not something they could control with prayer or theology. It was something that required lead, silk, and the destruction of beauty. There is a tragic footnote to the day of the banishment. The glassmakers of Avignon, who had become wealthy providing mirrors to the papal court, were suddenly seen as purveyors of heresy. Their workshops were raided, their secret formulas for silver and glass were seized, and many of them were forced to work in the sublevels to create the specialized dull glass that the Church now required for its lamps. The informative history of the Venetian glass guilds mentions a sudden decline in the Avignon market during the 1360s. Now, we know the secret reason. It wasn't an economic shift. It was a total ban on the reflective surface. The Church wanted to ensure that no one else could accidentally trigger a transmutation. They wanted to monopolize the miraculous light by burying it. The glassmakers who refused to comply were accused of making the devil's looking glass and were executed. Their bodies burned so that their crystalline potential could not be realized, even today. In the older sections of the Palais des Papes, there are rooms where the mirrors have never been replaced. The walls are bare, and the atmosphere is heavy with the memory of that dark winter. Tourists often report a feeling of being watched in these empty spaces, a sensation of a gaze that has no source. This is the ocular echo of 1362, the lingering resonance of a pope who saw too much and was himself too much to be seen. The mirrors were gone, but the pope's eyes remained. And in the darkness of his mirrorless room, the pope began to see things that did not require light. He began to describe the internal structures of the earth, the veins of gold and the rivers of fire that flowed beneath the palace. He was no longer looking at the world. He was looking through it. The banishment had not stopped the transformation. It had only forced it to go deeper. The mirrors were shattered, and the fountains were dry, but the church had forgotten one thing. The eyes of a human being are themselves reflective. When the Cardinal of Carcassonne finally worked up the courage to enter the Pope's chamber to announce the completion of the silver mask, he made a fatal mistake. He looked directly into the Pope's golden lenses, and in that moment he didn't see the Pope, he saw himself reflected in the Pope's eyes. But he didn't see his face. He saw his own internal skeleton, glowing with a white, hot fire. In our next, The Secret Construction of the Silver Mask, we will witness the aftermath of that gaze. We will discover why the cardinal's flesh began to fall away in strips of dry parchment, and the secret reason why the blacksmiths who forged the mask had to do so while wearing hoods of lead. What was the star metal that was added to the silver to make it strong enough to hold back the Pope's gaze? The mask was not just a cover. It was a weapon of containment that had a price higher than any gold. The secret of the mask is about to be forged in the fire of a dying man's vision dug deep in the bedrock beneath Avignon. Far below the reach of the winter sun, a hammer struck a metal that came from the stars. It was not a sound of celebration, but a rhythmic tolling of a funeral bell for a man who refused to die. The blacksmiths were not craftsmen. They were prisoners bound by oaths of silence and hoods of heavy lead to protect them from the radiance of their own creation. They were forging a mask, but it was not intended for a king's coronation or a knight's protection. It was a silver cage for the face of a pope who had become a biological son. The metal was an unholy alloy of pure moonlight silver and a dark, jagged iron found in a crater in the Egyptian desert. This mask was designed with one purpose: to act as a circuit breaker for a gaze that was dismantling the walls of the palace. Every hammer blow was infused with a curse, a desperate attempt to seal away a truth that the Church could not allow the world to see. They were building a barrier between humanity and a transformation that threatened to rewrite the laws of nature. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of coal smoke and molten metal fills the air. You are descending the spiral stairs into the secret forge, a place where the heat of the furnace is the only thing keeping the dampness of the earth at bay. The air is thick, vibrating with the roar of the bellows and the clinking of chains. Breathe slowly and let the orange glow of the embers guide you into the hidden heart of the 14th century. Feel the weight of the silver in your hands, a cold weight that is about to be transformed by fire. The construction of the silver mask began on the same day the mirrors were banished from the palace. The Cardinal of Carcassonne realized that darkness alone was not enough to contain the Pope. They needed a physical seal, a mask that would never be removed, even in the event of the Pope's eventual passing. They sought out the finest goldsmith in Europe, a man named Marcello of Florence, but they did not bring him to the palace as a guest. He was kidnapped from his workshop under the cover of a storm and brought to Avignon in a cage. Marcello was a master of the Sire Perdue or lost wax casting method, a technique that allowed for incredible detail in metalwork. But the instructions he received in the basement of the Palais des Papes were unlike anything he had ever seen in the studios of the Renaissance. He was given a block of star metal, a substance that felt heavier than lead but was as hard as diamond. It was a fragment of a meteorite that had been kept in the Vatican's treasury for centuries. Whispered to be a piece of the throne of a fallen angel, the forge itself was a marvel of medieval engineering. It was powered by 4 massive bellows, each operated by a silent, hooded monk. The furnace was lined with bone ash and clay to withstand the extreme temperatures required to melt the star metal. Marcello noted in his secret sketches that the fire did not burn orange. It burned a pale, ghostly blue when the meteorite iron was introduced to the crucible. The air in the forge became so thin that the men had to take turns breathing through wet cloths. The silver mask was not made of pure silver. Marcello was commanded to create a sacred alloy. He was given a chest of silver coins that had been taken from the collection plates of every cathedral in France, silver that had been touched by the prayers of millions. This was to be the base of the mask, the lunar shield intended to cool the Pope's internal fire. But the secret ingredient was the star metal. When the silver and the meteorite iron were melted together, the resulting liquid did not behave like normal metal. It moved with a life of its own, swirling in the crucible in patterns that mimicked the hexagonal crystals appearing on the Pope's skin. Marcello realized that the metal was becoming informed by the proximity of the Pope, even through the layers of stone and earth above them. The metal was a mirror of the Pope's own transformation. The informativeness of this process is found in the metallurgical records of the time. The smiths used a technique called cupellation to ensure the silver was of the highest purity before adding the meteorite iron. They also added a pinch of powdered cinnabar and a drop of the Pope's own crystalline sweat, which had been collected by the physician Guy de Chauliac. This made the mask a biological extension of the Pope himself. It was a symbiotic seal, a piece of metal that would recognize the energy of its wearer and tighten its grip in response to any surge of radiance. The most horrific aspect of the mask's construction was the toll it took on the men who made it. Because the star metal alloy emitted a faint, violet light even in its molten state, the blacksmiths were forced to wear heavy hoods made of lead with only tiny slits for their eyes. Even so, the radiation was too much. Marcello's apprentices began to lose their sight within a week of beginning the project. Their eyes would turn cloudy and white, as if they had looked directly at the sun for too long. Marcello himself began to experience auditory hallucinations. He claimed he could hear the metal speaking to him, a series of tonal clicks and hums that matched the sounds coming from the Pope's bedroom upstairs. He felt as though he was not forging a mask, but a face for a god that had not yet been born. The psychological pressure was immense. He knew that the moment the mask was finished, he would likely be executed to prevent the secret of its construction from leaking. This fear led Marcello to build a fail-safe into the mask. He etched a series of microscopic runes on the inside of the faceplate, hidden within the floral patterns of the engraving. These runes were designed to vibrate at a frequency that would neutralize the Pope's energy if the mask were ever removed by force. Marcello was an artist, and he could not bear the thought of his masterpiece becoming a permanent tool of the Church's tyranny without a way to break the seal. He was gambling his soul on a piece of hidden geometry. Once the alloy was cast into the shape of a human face, the true work began. Marcello spent 40 days and 40 nights etching the surface of the mask with a needle made of diamond. The patterns were not random decorations. They were a map of the constellations as they appeared on the night of the Pope's birth, combined with the hexagonal lattice of the crystalline transformation. The mask was designed to be refractive. This means that instead of simply blocking the light coming from the Pope's eyes, the mask would catch the light and bounce it through a series of internal chambers within the silver, eventually bleeding the energy off into the laid lining of the casket. It was a medieval version of a heat sink. The mask would actually get hot to the touch as it worked, absorbing the soul fire of the Pontiff and converting it into harmless thermal energy. The informativeness of the engraving is staggering. Marcello had to account for the curvature of the Pope's new, faceted eyes. He created 2 silver lenses within the eye sockets of the mask made of polished obsidian. These lenses were designed to prevent the Pope from seeing his own reflection in the silver, while still allowing the Church to say that the Pope was watching over his flock through the silver face. It was a masterpiece of deception, a way to make a prison look like a relic. The final stage of the construction involved a ritual that blurred the line between blacksmithing and high magic. The Cardinal of Carcassonne insisted that the mask be quenched in a vat of holy water that had been mixed with the ashes of burned heretical texts. This was intended to spiritualize the metal, giving it the authority of the Church to command the Pope's spirit to remain within the confines of the lead casket. As the glowing red mask was plunged into the vat, the steam that rose from the water was said to take the shape of 100 screaming faces. The sound was so loud that the monks in the cathedral above stopped their prayers, thinking the end of the world had arrived. But below ground, the blacksmith simply watched as the silver cooled into a dull, matte gray. The mask had lost its shine, but it had gained a density that made it feel as though it weighed 100 pounds. The metal was now dead. It had been purged of all its own light, so that it could better absorb the light of the Pope. Marcello held the mask up to the flickering torchlight and saw that it no longer reflected his own face. It was like looking into a hole in reality. The silver mask was ready. It was a cold, unyielding face that would soon become the only face the world would ever see of Pope Innocent VI. Marcello of Florence was not executed, but he was not allowed to leave. He was kept in a cell next to the forge, his eyes now almost completely useless. He spent his final days scratching the floor with a piece of charcoal, trying to redraw the patterns he had etched into the mask. He was obsessed with the idea that the star metal was not a containment device, but a catalyst. He believed that by putting the mask on the Pope, the Church was not stopping the transformation, but completing it. He wrote in a final, frantic note that the mask would act as a third eye for the Pope, allowing him to see into the heart of the sun itself. Marcello's mind had been shattered by the proximity to the meteorite iron and the Pope's energy. He saw the world as a giant interlocking system of crystals, and he believed that the silver mask was the key to unlocking the final door. His moral rot was complete. He no longer cared about the Church or the Pope, only about the beauty of the geometry he had created. This psychological layer highlights the danger of the lore slumber archive. To know these details is to risk the same obsession that destroyed Marcello. The silver mask is a symbol of human ingenuity used for the darkest purposes. It is the point where art meets the abyss. And as the mask was carried up the stairs to the papal apartments, the air in the palace grew cold once again. As if the stones themselves were bracing for the final sealing of the truth, the Church went to great lengths to ensure that the recipe for the sacred alloy was lost to time. They burned Marcello's sketches and executed the apprentices who had helped with the forge. The only record that remains is a series of cryptic entries in the Vatican secret metallurgical ledger. Under the heading Item 362, the face of the star, these records provide a scientific bridge for our Tier 1 audience. They describe the exact weight of the silver used, the chemical composition of the star metal, and the temperature of the forge. They show that the Church was not relying on faith. They were relying on a very advanced, very secret form of material science. They knew that the spirit of the Pope was a physical force, and they treated it as such. The silver mask was a technological solution to a theological problem. The ledgers also mention that the mask required a silver solder made from the melted-down jewelry of the Pope's own family. This was to ensure a blood bond between the mask and the wearer. The informativeness of these details paints a picture of a conspiracy that reached into every aspect of the Pope's life. Nothing was accidental. Every molecule of the mask was chosen to ensure that the Pope would remain a silent, silver-faced prisoner for all eternity. If one were to visit the sublevels of the Palais des Papes today, they would find that the area where the forge once stood is still remarkably warm. The stone walls have absorbed the heat of that blue fire furnace for over 600 years and are still radiating it back. Local legends say that the ghost of the smith can still be heard striking his anvil on the night of a lunar eclipse. The same night the mask was supposedly finished. The informative value of this thermal anomaly is a reminder that the construction of the silver mask was an event of massive energy. It was a point of focus where the cosmic, the meteorite, and the earthly, the silver, were brought together to suppress the divine, the Pope. The forge was the womb of the cover-up, the place where the lie was given a physical, metallic form. The heat is a testament to the power that was required to keep the truth from burning through the floorboards, the mask itself. Now resting inside the lead casket in the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction is said to be as cold as ice. It has finished its work. It has absorbed all the energy the Pope had to give, and now it sits in the darkness, a silver face staring at a lead ceiling. But those who have seen the mask in their dreams say that it is no longer matte gray. They say it has begun to shine with an inner light, a sign that the star metal has finally saturated and the energy is looking for a way out. As we reach the final hours of the mask's journey from the forge to the bedroom, we must reflect on the sheer weight of the object. It was not a light ornament. It was a burden. When the Cardinal of Carcassonne picked it up from the workbench, he was shocked by how heavy it felt. It felt like holding the weight of a man's soul in his hands. He realized that once this mask was placed on the Pope, there would be no going back. The humanity of the papacy would be officially and permanently replaced by a silver icon. The mask was wrapped in a cloth of unbleached wool and carried through the corridors in total silence. No one was allowed to see it. It was a secret weapon, a tool of the great silence that was being enacted across the city. The psychological weight of the mask was felt by everyone who crossed its path. They felt a sense of dread, a premonition of a world where the faces of our leaders are made of metal and their hearts are made of crystal. The construction was finished. The forge was cold. Marcello was in his cell. The mask was on its way. The stage was set for the final application. The moment when the silver would touch the amber skin and the circuit would be closed. But as the cardinal reached the door of the Pope's chamber, he noticed that the mask was starting to vibrate in his hands. It was humming, responding to the proximity of the being it was designed to contain. The humming of the mask is a detail that appears in several of the secret journals. It was a sound that could not be heard with the ears, but felt in the teeth and the bones. It was a frequency of 12.4 Hertz, the same frequency that has been recorded by modern sensors inside the tomb. The mask was tuning itself to the Pope. It was finding the exact resonance required to cancel out his energy. This is the informative core of the silver mask mystery. It was a biological and mechanical interface. It was designed to merge with the Pope's crystalline structure, creating a single, unified system that was stable and inert. The mask was the lock and the Pope's energy was the key. Once they were joined, the door to the other dimension would be closed, and the Church could go back to the business of ruling the world of men. But as the cardinal opened the door, he saw that the Pope was no longer sitting in his chair. He was standing, his entire body glowing with a white fire that threatened to melt the lead lining of the walls. The Pope turned to look at the mask, and for a second, the cardinal saw the silver faceplate reflect the light of 1,000 suns. The mask was the only thing that could save them, or it was the thing that would destroy them all. The mask was held up to the Pope's face, and the silver began to glow red hot as it approached the golden skin. But what happened when the metal touched the Pope's forehead was something that even Master Valeris had not predicted. The mask did not just sit on the face. It began to melt into the crystal, the silver and the amber fusing together in a blinding flash of light that knocked the cardinal unconscious. When he woke up, the Pope was gone, replaced by a being of silver and light that could no longer be called a man. In our next, the failed exorcism of the flesh, we will witness the moment the Church realized that the mask had not stopped the transformation, it had merely accelerated it. We will discover why the priest's holy water turned to steam before it touched the Pope's skin, and the terrifying secret of the silver scream that echoed through the palace for 3 days and 3 nights. What happens when the Church tries to cast a demon out of a man who has become a god? The answer is buried in the ashes of the palace, waiting for you to uncover it. In the spring of 1362, the Vatican committed a silent sacrilege that was never recorded in the official registers. They brought the great exorcist, Bishop Malatesta, to the bedside of a man who was already a god of glass. The Church was convinced that the Pope's crystalline skin was a manifestation of a demonic possession, a physical curse born of a pact with the fallen. They arrived with silver crosses, vials of holy salt, and the ironclad faith of 1,000 years. But the ritual did not go as planned. When the bishop began the first incantation of the ritual Romanum, the holy water did not sizzle against the Pope's skin. It evaporated instantly, turning into a thick, sweet-smelling vapor that smelled of ozone and ancient earth. The crosses did not burn the flesh. They began to vibrate and hum, their metal structure weakening as if the Pope's body were absorbing the very concept of the divine. This was the moment the hierarchy realized their prayers were useless. They were not fighting a demon from the pit, but the inevitable march of a new kind of human nature. The Pope was not possessed. He was evolving, and the church was trying to cast a soul out of a body that had already become its own heaven. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of cold stone and extinguished tallow fills the air. You are descending into the heart of the papal apartments, a place where the shadows are thick enough to touch. The world outside is asleep, dreaming of simple things, but here, the air is charged with a frequency that defies the senses. Step softly onto the cold flagstones and let the rhythmic pulse of history guide your breathing. We are entering the night of the great silence. The night when faith met biology and lost. The chamber of Pope Innocent VI was no longer a bedroom. It was a sanctuary of sterile amber light. The Bishop Malatesta stood at the foot of the bed, his robes heavy with the weight of tradition. He was a man who had seen the darkest corners of the human psyche, a man who had cast out spirits that made the brave weep. But as he looked at the pontiff, he did not see the contorted face of the possessed. He saw a mask of perfect, crystalline peace. The Pope's eyes were open, golden and unblinking. Reflecting the flickering candlelight in 1,000 hexagonal facets, the bishop began the rite of exorcism with a voice that was meant to command the very foundations of hell. Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus, he chanted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. But the sound felt wrong. Instead of the sharp, commanding tone of the ritual, the words seemed to be swallowed by the Pope's body. The air in the room grew heavy, a pressure building in the ears of the attending monks. It was not the pressure of evil, but the pressure of an immense, focused energy. The informative details of this night are found in the suppressed letters of the bishop's assistant, a young deacon named Francesco. He noted that the candles in the room did not flicker with the wind. They leaned toward the Pope, their flames drawn by a magnetic pull that should not exist. The bishop reached for the hyssop to sprinkle the holy water, but as the droplets left the branch, they froze in mid-air. For a fraction of a second, the water hung like diamonds in the light, before shattering into a fine mist. This was the first sign that the spiritual tools of the Church were being neutralized by a physical reality. The bishop, undeterred, pressed a silver crucifix against the Pope's forehead. This was the moment of the first breach. In any other case of possession, the silver would have left a mark of burning, a sign of the spirit's agony. But as the silver touched the amber skin, the metal began to soften. It did not melt from heat. It lost its structural integrity. The crucifix sagged like wet clay, its surface turning dull and gray. The Pope did not scream. He did not growl. He simply looked through the bishop with eyes that were no longer human. The psychological layer of this failure began to settle over the room like a shroud. The bishop, a man whose entire world was built on the hierarchy of spirit over matter, was witnessing the matter itself becoming the spirit. He realized that his words had no power because there was no other to command. The Pope was not hosting a guest. He was becoming the house. The crystallization was not an external attack, but an internal restructuring of the very definition of a man. The moral decay of the situation was the Church's refusal to acknowledge a miracle that they did not. Otha, they wanted a demon because a demon could be defeated. They could not defeat a new state of existence. As the Bishop Malatesta realized that the silver was failing, he turned to the most potent weapon in the Vatican's arsenal, the relic of St. Peter's bone. This fragment of ancient calcium was believed to carry the direct authority of the first pope, a conduit for the power of the keys. He held the golden glass reliquary over the pontiff's chest, and began the secondary prayers of the exorcismus. But as he spoke, the glass of the reliquary did not crack. It began to hum in perfect unison with the Pope's own internal frequency. The bone within the glass started to glow with a faint violet light, responding to the Pope as if it were a long-lost part of a single, unified machine. The informative history of this specific relic is often glossed over in standard texts. The bone was said to be incorruptible, a sign of its holy status. But on this night, the incorruptibility became a bridge. The energy coming from the Pope was looking for a path, and the relic provided it. The bishop felt a sudden, sharp chill travel up his arm, a coldness so absolute it felt like his blood was turning to slush. He tried to drop the reliquary, but his hand was frozen to the metal. He was being pulled into the Pope's circuit, Petrus de Alvernia, whose journals have guided us through this history, was standing in the corner of the room, recording every detail. He noted that the bishop's eyes began to glaze over, taking on a subtle golden sheen. The ritual was no longer an exorcism. It was a transmission. The Pope's crystalline biology was not fighting the bishop. It was informing him. It was as if the Pope were a library of light and the bishop were a reader who was being overwhelmed by the volume of the text. The room began to smell of burnt sugar and ozone. This sensory detail is crucial, for it points to a high-energy atmospheric discharge. In modern terms, we would recognize this as the ionization of the air. In 1362, the monks believed the air was being purged of all life. They huddled together, their fingers white as they gripped their rosaries. They saw the shadows on the walls beginning to move, not like demons, but like geometric shapes, expanding and contracting in time with the Pope's breathing. The bishop's voice shifted from a command to a plea. He was no longer trying to cast anything out. He was trying to maintain his own identity. He began to recite the creed, but the words came out backwards. Not because of a demonic influence, but because the linguistic centers of his brain were being restructured by the resonance in the room. He was losing the ability to use human language, replaced by the same tonal clicks and hums that the Pope had been using for weeks. The psychological decay of the scene was profound. The monks watched their leader, the champion of the faith, being dismantled by a man who was supposed to be his master. They realized that the hierarchy they had spent their lives serving was a house of cards in the face of this transformation. If the Pope was becoming something more than human, then the Church's entire mission was based on a lie of limitations. The transformation was a declaration that the human body was not a prison, but a seed. Valeris, the alchemist still in his cell, would have recognized this as the albedo stage of the great work, the whitening, the purification. The body was being purged of its base organic impurities, leaving behind a structure that was capable of hosting a much higher frequency of consciousness. The exorcism was an attempt to stop a birth. It was an act of cosmic abortion, fueled by the fear of the unknown. The Church was trying to protect the world of the living from the world of the eternal, not realizing that the two were the same. The informative records of the evening mention that the Cardinal of Carcassonne, watching from the doorway, ordered the monks to begin the rite of the shroud. This was a protocol used for the burial of a saint, intended to cover the body in heavy, salt-soaked linen to dampen its influence. But the monks were too terrified to move. They saw the Pope's body beginning to lift off the bed, a fraction of an inch at a time, held up by a repulsive magnetic force. The bed itself, made of heavy oak and iron, began to groan under the strain of the energy. This was the night the Church realized that the miracle of Avignon was not a gift, but a challenge. It was a challenge to their authority, their science, and their very existence. They were looking into the face of a future they were not ready for, a future where the divine was not a distant judge, but a physical state of being. The failed exorcism was the final proof that the transformation was absolute. It could not be prayed away. It could not be scared away. It could only be buried. As the clock struck 3 in the morning, the hour traditionally associated with the mockery of the divine, the failed exorcism reached its terrifying climax. The Bishop Malatesta, now completely silent and unresponsive, was standing as if in a trance. Suddenly, the Pope's chest expanded to a size that seemed impossible for a human rib cage. There was a sound of cracking, but it was not the sound of bone. It was the sound of a glacier shifting. And then came the silver scream. It was not a vocalization. It was a sonic blast that shattered every piece of glassware in the papal apartments. The windows of the chamber blew outward, sending shards of leaded glass into the courtyard like shrapnel. The sound was a high-frequency vibration that did not stop. It sustained itself for nearly 60 seconds. The monks fell to their knees, their ears bleeding as the air in the room began to glow with a pale, violet light. This was the voice of the crystal, the sound of the atoms themselves being rearranged into a new, terrifying harmony. The informative details of this sound are preserved in the folk legends of Avignon. People living miles away claimed they heard a celestial hum that made their teeth rattle and their vision blur. Some reported that the milk in their kitchens turned sour instantly, and the dogs in the street began to howl in a specific rhythmic pattern. The silver scream was the Pope's final declaration of his new nature. He was no longer capable of human speech because he was now speaking the language of the minerals. The language of the stars? The Bishop Malatesta collapsed the moment the sound stopped. He was not dead, but he was changed. His skin had taken on a gray, ashen quality, and he would never speak again. He would spend the rest of his life in a silent cell, staring at his hands as if he were trying to remember what it felt like to be made of flesh. He was the first casualty of the failed exorcism, a man who had looked too deeply into the light of Avignon and found that he was not strong enough to reflect it. The psychological layer of the scream was its total lack of emotion. It was not a scream of pain, nor was it a scream of anger. It was a scream of transition. It was the sound of a soul breaking through the limits of the biological vessel. The monks who survived the night described it as the sound of truth being told through a throat of iron. They realized that the Pope was not being tormented. He was being freed. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. If the Pope was being freed from the human condition, then the human condition was a trap. The Church's response to the scream was one of immediate and total suppression. The Cardinal of Carcassonne moved into the room with a squad of the Swiss Guard, their ears plugged with beeswax and their eyes covered by thin veils of silk. They did not look at the Pope. They treated him like a piece of high-explosive material. They threw a heavy, lead-lined shroud over him, which seemed to dampen the vibration of the scream. The room went silent, but it was the silence of a tomb, not a sanctuary. The informative history of the lead shroud is a fascinating example of medieval containment technology. The shroud was not made of fabric. It was a fine mesh of lead wire woven into wool. It was designed by Master Valerius before his arrest, intended specifically to block the ocular rays and harmonic discharges of a transmuted being. The fact that the Church had it ready proves that they had never truly believed in the exorcism. They were merely performing a play for the sake of the records, a way to say they had tried the spiritual path before turning to the material one. The failed exorcism proved that theology was a map for a world that no longer existed. The Pope had moved off the map. He had become an explorer in a landscape of pure light and geometry. The Church, in its moral decay, decided that the map was more important than the explorer. They chose to preserve the institution by destroying the evidence of its evolution. They buried the Pope because they could not explain him, and they could not explain him because they were afraid to become like him. As the monks were led out of the room, they were told that they had witnessed a demonic manifestation of unprecedented power. They were sworn to secrecy under the threat of the pyre, but they knew the truth. They had seen the silver crosses melt. They had heard the silver screen. They had felt the air turn to ozone. They knew that whatever was under that lead shroud was not a demon. It was the next stage of the great work, and it was beautiful. And because it was beautiful, and because it was not theirs, the Church had to destroy it. The morning after the failed exorcism, the papal apartments were a scene of ruin and revelation. The dust from the shattered windows hung in the air, each speck of dust reflecting a tiny violet glint from the shrouded figure on the bed. The Cardinal of Carcassonne sat at the Pope's desk, reading through the notes of the night. He saw the report of the melting crucifix. He saw the description of the frozen holy water, and he saw the final, terrified scrawl of the scribe. It is not a spirit. It is the man himself. He is becoming the stone. The informative depth of this realization is the key to the entire Vatican cover-up. The stone the scribe referred to was the lapis philosophorum. The philosopher's stone. The Church leaders realized that the Pope's transformation was the physical manifestation of the alchemical ultimate. He had achieved what the heretics had been seeking for centuries, the union of the spirit and the matter in a single, incorruptible form. If word of this reached the alchemists of Europe, the Church would lose its monopoly on the divine. Every man would seek the Avignon method, to become his own god of glass. The psychological decay of the hierarchy was now complete. They had moved from being protectors of the faith to being jailers of the truth. They realized that the Pope could never be allowed to speak again, even if he were capable of it. His very existence was a heretical document written in amber and silver. They began to plan the eternal burial, a process that would involve more than just a casket. It would involve the erasure of a man's life and the creation of a myth to replace him. The failed exorcism had one final, unexpected result. The contagion of the transformation had begun to spread to the room itself. The stone floor where the bishop had collapsed was starting to show the same hexagonal patterns as the Pope's skin. The oak bed frame had turned brittle and metallic. The transformation was a physical resonance that was rewriting the surrounding matter. This is why the lead-line casket was so crucial. It wasn't just to hide the Pope. It was to contain a biological fire that could consume the world. The informative details of the containment are chilling. The Church did not just use lead. They used dead lead, metal that had been buried in the earth for 100 years to lose its metallic spirit. They were building a cage for a miracle. They were treating the Pope like a plague victim, a source of infection that had to be quarantined at all costs. The moral decay of this decision is the central theme of the Lore Slumber Archive, the preservation of power, through the suppression of human potential. As you listen to the slow, rhythmic pulse of this story, consider the fate of the Bishop Malatesta. He was the man who was supposed to save the Pope. Instead, he became a hollow shell, a witness to a truth that his mind could not contain. He is a symbol of the old world, the world of faith and fear, meeting the new world of light and geometry. The bishop did not fail because his faith was weak. He failed because his faith was too small. He was trying to cast a demon out of a man who was becoming a star. The air in your room is still now. The shadows are quiet, and the scent of the 14th century is fading. The story of the failed exorcism is a story of a boundary being crossed. It is the moment where the Church realized that the divine was not a distant judge, but a physical possibility. And because they were afraid of that possibility, they chose the darkness. They chose the lead. They chose the silence. The Pope remained under his lead shroud, a glowing, unblinking entity waiting for the next stage of his journey. The failed exorcism was the end of the Church's attempt to use the spiritual to control the physical. From that night on, they used the material to control the spiritual. They used the forge, the vault, and the lead box. They became the architects of a secret that has lasted for 700 years. But the resonance of the silver scream still echoes in the sub-levels of the palace, a reminder that some truths cannot be buried forever. The exorcism had failed, and the Pope was now a prisoner of his own evolution. But the lead shroud was only a temporary measure. The Cardinal of Carcassonne knew that the energy was still building and the contagion was still spreading. He needed a place to put the Pope where he would never be found, and a container that could hold a being made of light and gravity. He needed the help of a man he had imprisoned months ago, the alchemist master. VALARIUS. In our next, the architect of the Vatican's lid vault. We will discover the secret deal made between the Church and the heretic. We will uncover the hidden blueprints of the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction and the terrifying reason why the vault had to be built with vacuum chambers and layers of crushed charcoal. What was the price of the vault? And why did the men who built it have to be buried alive alongside their creation? The secret of the lead casket is about to be revealed, and the weight of the truth will be more than you can imagine. In the summer of 1362, the Church did not build a tomb. They built a prison for a man who had become a star. The decision to bury Pope Innocent VI in the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction was a calculated betrayal of tradition, a desperate lie designed to hide a biological curse that stone could not contain. They realized that a simple grave of marble and wood would be torn apart from the inside within days. The Pope's body was radiating a crystalline energy that shattered stone and turned organic matter into ash. To stop this contagion, the Vatican commissioned the most complex burial chamber in human history, a vault of lead and charcoal that weighed more than a cathedral. The architect was not a man of God, but a prisoner who understood that the only way to stop the light was to drown it in the heaviest metal of the earth. They used 3 inches of solid lead to seal a secret that was vibrating with the force of an ancient god. Every mason who touched the stones was sworn to a silence that ended only in their premature graves. This was the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of cold earth and wet limestone fills the air. You are descending into the construction site of the 14th century, leaving behind the warmth of the sun and the sounds of the living world. The shadows here are heavy, weighted by the pressure of the bedrock above. Step slowly into the flickering torchlight and let the rhythmic sound of the hammer on lead guide your breath. We are entering the blueprint of the Great Silence, the place where architecture was used to kill a miracle. the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction, located across the river from Avignon, was chosen for its isolation and its deep, stable foundations. But the original plans for the papal tomb were burned the moment the silver scream was heard in the palace. The Cardinal of Carcassonne realized that the energy coming from the Pope was not spiritual. It was physical. It was a resonance that moved through the air like a wave. If the Pope were buried in a traditional church, he would eventually resonate with the stone walls, turning the entire building into a transmitter for his transformation. The new architect was brought in under the cover of darkness. He was a master mason named Olivier of Toulouse, but his true specialty was the construction of high-security dungeons and alchemical vaults. Olivier was shown the journals of Petrus d'Alverna and the research of Master Valerius. He was told the truth. The body they were burying was no longer made of flesh. It was a biological crystal that was still growing, still vibrating, and still looking for a way to expand. Olivier's first realization was that stone is porous. On a microscopic level, stone is filled with air and water. This meant that the Pope's energy could travel through a stone sarcophagus as easily as a sound travels through a hallway. He needed a material that was dead to vibration. He needed lead. In the medieval mind, lead was the most base of metals, the furthest from the light of the sun. It was associated with Saturn, the god of time and limitations. To bury someone in lead was to anchor them to the very bottom of the material world. The informative details of the vault's construction reveal a staggering level of engineering. Olivier did not just build a box. He designed a series of concentric barriers. The innermost chamber was a casket of pure silver, as we have discussed. But this silver casket was placed inside a much larger lead box, and the space between the two was filled with a mixture of crushed charcoal and bone ash. Charcoal was believed to absorb the miasma of the soul, but in modern terms it acted as a primitive insulator, preventing the electrical discharges of the Pope from reaching the outer walls. The weight of the lead used was unprecedented. The records show that over 50 tons of lead were transported to the Chartreuse in secret shipments. This was enough lead to roof 3 cathedrals, but it was all concentrated into a single subterranean chamber. The goal was to use the sheer density of the metal to crush the frequency of the Pope's vibration. Olivier believed that if they used enough weight, the energy would eventually exhaust itself, unable to move the massive atoms of the lead. The lead used for the vault of 1362 was not standard commercial lead. Olivier of Toulouse insisted on what he called dead lead. This was metal that had been mined decades earlier and left to sit in the dark for a generation. The alchemists believed that fresh lead still contained a spark of the sun that made it reactive. To contain the Pope, they needed metal that had lost all its spirit. Metal that was as cold and inert as the center of a mountain. This informative distinction is crucial for understanding the Tier 1 historical layer of the story. The Church sent agents to the abandoned mines of the Peak District in England to recover lead that had been cast into ingots during the reign of the previous century. This lead had a higher density of certain isotopes, which in modern physics would be recognized as having a different radioactive profile. In 1362, they simply knew it felt heavier and colder than any other metal. The construction of the vault was a psychological nightmare for the Masons. Working with lead in a confined space is dangerous. The fumes from the melting solder and the fine dust from the hammering began to affect their minds. They reported seeing shadows that didn't move and hearing a static hum that made their hair stand on end. They were building a cage for a miracle, and the miracle was fighting back. The energy from the Pope's body, even through the temporary lead shrouds, was leaking into the bedrock of the Chartreuse. Olivier designed the vault with a vacuum principle. Between the lead lining and the stone exterior, he created a series of airtight chambers. He believed that if he could remove the air, the sound of the Pope's soul would have no medium to travel through. While they could not achieve a true vacuum with medieval technology, they used a system of bellows and wax seals to create a low-pressure environment. This is one of the first recorded instances of intentional acoustic and energetic insulation in history. The moral decay of the Church was evident in how they treated the workers. Olivier and his 30 masons were kept in total isolation within the monastery grounds. They were not allowed to speak to the monks or the townspeople. They were fed through a small hole in the wall. The Cardinal of Carcassonne had already decided that once the vault was sealed, the men who knew its structural weaknesses would have to be dealt with. The lie was so large that it required the sacrifice of the very men who built its cage. The architecture of the vault also included a sacrificial floor. Beneath the sarcophagus, Olivier laid a 3-foot layer of salt and sulfur. This was intended to ground any energy that managed to penetrate the lead. The salt would act as a desiccant, drawing moisture away from the metal to prevent corrosion, while the sulfur was believed to act as a spiritual poison that would keep the Pope's consciousness trapped within the box. It was a multi-layered system of physical and metaphysical defense. As you listen to the slow, rhythmic description of these layers, consider the intent of the designers. They were not trying to honor the Pope. They were trying to forget him. A simple grave is a place of memory, a place where people come to pray and remember the life of the departed. But Olivier's vault was designed to be a void. It was an anti-monument, a place where the physical presence of the Pope would be neutralized until he was nothing more than a dense, cold point in the earth. The informativeness of the architectural blueprints, which were hidden for centuries, shows that the vault was shaped like an inverted pyramid. The widest part was at the top, covered by massive stone slabs, while the sarcophagus rested at the very tip of the point, deep in the earth. This design was intended to focus the weight of the entire monastery onto the casket, using gravity itself as a seal. The Church was using the weight of the world to keep the light of the Pope from rising. The final stages of the vault's construction were carried out in a state of frantic secrecy. The Pope's condition was deteriorating, or rather, it was perfecting itself. The humming in the palace had become so loud that the cardinals could no longer sleep. They moved the Pope to the Chartreuse in the middle of a moonless night, his body wrapped in layers of leaded wool and carried on a wagon with reinforced axles. When they arrived at the vault, the masons were waiting, their faces covered in gray dust and their eyes red from the lead fumes. The process of lowering the casket into the inverted pyramid was a feat of terrifying precision. Olivier had designed a system of lead-coated ropes and copper pulleys to ensure that no spark would be created. They knew that if a single spark hit the ionized air around the Pope, it might trigger an explosion that would level the monastery. The masons worked in absolute silence, their breathing heavy and synchronized. They felt the weight of the casket changing as it descended into the vault, as if the energy within were fighting the pull of gravity. The informative history of the Chartreuse Masons is a dark chapter in the annals of the trade. These men were the best in their field, yet they were being forced to build a structure that violated every principle of their craft. Instead of building toward the light, they were building toward the dark. They were using dead lead to seal a living light. They began to write their names on the inside of the lead plates. A final, desperate act of identity before they were erased from the world. Once the casket was in place, the eternal sealing began. Olivier ordered the masons to pour molten lead into the gaps between the casket and the inner walls of the vault. This created a single monolithic block of metal that encased the silver sarcophagus completely. There were no seams. There were no joints. It was a seamless prison of 50 tons of lead. As the liquid metal cooled, the humming from the Pope's body began to change. It became a low, muffled throb, like a heartbeat heard through a thick wall. The psychological layer of the story reaches its peak during this sealing. The Masons realized that they were not just burying a man, they were burying a future. They saw the violet light leaking out of the seams before the lead was poured, and they knew that what they were sealing away was something beautiful and terrifying. They felt a sense of profound loss, a realization that the Church was taking away a gift that belonged to all of humanity. The moral rot was no longer a secret. It was the very air they breathed. The final stone slab, a 10-ton piece of black granite, was lowered over the lead block. Olivier himself carved the final runes into the stone, not the name of the Pope, but a series of geometric symbols designed to lock the energy. The slab was then covered with a layer of earth and a second stone floor, effectively burying the vault under the floor of the chapel. To the outside world, it looked like a simple, elegant tomb. But beneath the surface, there was a machine of lead and pressure. The informative details of the pressure seal are found in the oral traditions of the Carthusian monks. They claimed that for years after the burial, the floor of the chapel would feel warm to the touch. They believed it was the breath of the saint, but we know it was the thermal energy of the Pope's transformation being absorbed by the lead. The vault was working. It was converting the soul fire into heat, bleeding it off into the earth so it could never gather enough strength to break the seal, but the price of the vault was not just metal and stone. The day after the sealing was complete, the Cardinal of Carcassonne arrived with a group of armed guards. The Masons were told they were being moved to a new project in Rome. Instead, they were led to a different part of the sublevels, a chamber that had been built alongside the vault. They were given a final meal and a cup of wine laced with the same liquid star that had started the Pope's transformation. They were buried alive in a communal grave, their voices silenced so the secret of the lead vault would never be told. The architect of the Vatican's lead vault, Olivier of Toulouse, was the only one allowed to live, though his life was a shadow of what it had been. He was kept as a consultant within the Vatican, his mind shattered by the lead poisoning and the weight of the secret he carried. He spent his final years drawing the same inverted pyramid over and over again, claiming that the lead was not thick enough. He believed that the Pope was still growing, still vibrating, and that one day the weight of the monastery would not be enough to hold him down. The informative legacy of Olivier's vault is the reason the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction remains one of the most mysterious sites in Europe. Modern historians have noted that the structural integrity of the chapel is far beyond what was necessary for the time. The pillars are twice as thick as they should be, and the foundations go 3 times deeper than any other building in the region. The entire monastery was designed to be an anchor, a physical weight intended to keep a single lead box from rising back into the light of the sun. The psychological decay of the church continued long after the Masons were gone. Every pope that followed Innocent VI had to visit the vault once during their reign. They had to stand on the black granite slab and listen to the silence. They had to feel the warmth of the floor and remember that their power was built on a foundation of lead and lies. The vault was a constant reminder that the miracle was real, but that the Church had chosen the structure over the spirit. The lead vault of 1362 is a study in the limits of human containment. We can build boxes of lead. We can pour 50 tons of metal. We can bury the witnesses and erase the blueprints. But energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. The soul fire of Pope Innocent VI is still there, deep beneath the floor of the chartreuse. It is still vibrating at 12.4 Hertz. It is still turning the lead into something else. A slow transmutation that has been happening for 7 centuries. The information we have shared. Tonight is a warning about the weight of the truth. When we try to bury a fundamental shift in our nature, we create a burden that lasts for generations. The lead casket is not just a grave. It is a debt. It is a debt of silence that the Vatican continues to pay every day that the vault remains sealed. The moral rot of the 14th century is the foundation of the modern world. A world where we choose the safety of the box over the danger of the light. As the air in your room becomes still and the shadows settle into the corners, imagine the weight of that lead block. Feel the pressure of the 50 tons of metal pressing down on the silver casket. The world above is light and fleeting, but the world below is heavy and eternal. The Pope remains in his inverted pyramid, a glowing, unblinking entity staring at a ceiling of solid lead. He is patient. He has all the time in the world, and he knows that lead is a soft metal. He knows that eventually, even the heaviest anchor will fail. The story of the architect and his vault is the story of the human attempt to control the divine through the material. We use our best science and our most brutal politics to keep the truth in a box. But the truth is like the crystal skin of the Pope. It is hard, it is persistent, and it reflects everything. Even in the total darkness of the lead vault, the truth is reflecting the weight of the lie that covers it. The vault was sealed, and the Masons were gone, but the Church had one final task to complete the cover-up. They had to erase Pope Innocent VI from the memory of the living. They had to ensure that when people looked at the history books, they saw a man of law and austerity, not a man of light and crystal. This was the Great Erasure, a psychological operation that spanned decades and involved the destruction of thousands of documents. In our next, the erasure of Pope Innocent VI from history, we will discover how the Vatican rewrote the records of the 14th century. We will uncover the secret scriptoria where the new history was forged, and the terrifying reason why certain years were completely removed from the Church's calendar. What happened to the people who remembered the silver scream? And how do you kill a memory that is written in the very stones of a city? The silence of the lead vault is about to be joined by the silence of the archives. And the final layer of the lie is about to be laid. In the year 1362. The Vatican committed the most successful crime in the history of the human record. They murdered a memory. After the lead vault was sealed in the chartreuse, the Church realized that the physical body of Pope Innocent VI was not the only threat. The greater danger lay in the ink and parchment held in the hands of the living. To protect the status quo, the secret consistory launched the Great Erasure, a systematic campaign of betrayal and forgery designed to replace a biological nightmare with a boring historical lie. They did not just burn books. They rewrote the very timeline of the 14th century. Every mention of a crystal skin, every account of the silver scream, and every medical report describing a man turning into a star was gathered and cast into a furnace that burned for 40 nights. In their place, the Church fabricated a mundane narrative of a tired old man dying of a simple fever. They created a forbidden shadow over the year 1362, ensuring that any scholar who looked too closely would find only a wall of manufactured silence. This was the work of the Shadow Scriptorium, a hidden room of monks who spent their lives perfecting the art of the historical lie. They buried the truth under a mountain of false paperwork, leaving the world to believe in a pope who never truly existed. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold ash fills the air. You are entering the world of the Shadow Scriptorium, a place where the scratching of the quill is the only sound and the only light comes from the dying embers of a fireplace. The world outside thinks it knows its history, but here, in the flickering dark, you will see how easily the past can be unmade. Breathe slowly, and let the rhythmic sound of the pen on vellum guide you into the heart of the conspiracy. Feel the weight of the secrets that were never meant to reach your ears. Secrets that were erased to keep the world in a state of comfortable ignorance. The official history books tell us that Pope Innocent VI was a man of legal brilliance, a stern reformer who sought to bring order to a chaotic church. They tell us he died peacefully on September 12, 1362, and was buried with the usual honors. But this version of the man was a carefully constructed character, a mask made of words to hide the being of amber and light. The erasure began the very moment the Cardinal of Carcassonne stepped out of the Pope's death chamber. He did not call for the choir to sing the requiem. He called for the master of the archives. The informative depth of the great erasure is a study in the power of information control. In the medieval world, the Vatican was the central node of information. They controlled the scriptoria, the universities, and the diplomatic channels between kings. If the Vatican said a man died of a fever, then for all intents and purposes, he died of a fever. But to make the lie stick, they had to remove every piece of evidence to the contrary. This meant a total seizure of every private diary, every diplomatic letter, and every merchant's ledger in the city of Avignon. The first stage of the erasure was the purge of the witnesses. Every servant who had been in the palace during the Pope's final months was brought before the Inquisition. They were not accused of heresy, but of spiritual confusion. They were forced to sign confessions stating that what they had seen, the glowing skin, the metallic breath, the crystal eyes, was a series of hallucinations caused by a localized outbreak of ergot poisoning in the palace bread. Once the confessions were signed, the witnesses were sent to distant monasteries in the Alps or the Pyrenees, where they were forbidden from speaking to anyone for the rest of their lives. Next came the destruction of the physical evidence. The Pope's personal robes, which had become stiff and reflective from his crystalline sweat, were not preserved as relics. They were burned in a secret courtyard, the smoke carrying away the last physical traces of the transmutation. The furniture from his room, including the bed that had begun to turn into stone, was broken into pieces and thrown into the Rhine River. The church was not just burying a man, they were sanitizing a crime scene. They were ensuring that if anyone ever opened the lead vault, there would be no context for what they found inside. While the city of Avignon mourned a man they didn't know, A team of 12 monks worked in a windowless room beneath the Apostolic Palace. This was the Shadow Scriptorium, and their task was to create a new past. They were masters of paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. They could mimic the script of any scribe in Europe, and they used this skill to forge thousands of pages of official documents. They wrote false medical reports, fabricated letters from the Pope to his relatives, and even created fake entries in the papal ledger showing the purchase of standard medicines and foods that the Pope could no longer eat. The psychological layer of this operation is the realization that the Church was gaslighting the future. They knew that one day historians would come looking for the truth, so they provided them with a trail of breadcrumbs that led to a dead end. They focused on creating a consistent lie. If one document mentioned a fever, every document had to mention a fever. They even went so far as to forge letters from the Pope's physician, Guy de Chauliac, in which he complained about the Pope's stubbornness in refusing to take his herbal teas. It was a masterpiece of mundane detail, designed to make the impossible seem ordinary. One of the most informative aspects of the Shadow Scriptorium was their use of palimpsests. Palimpsest is a piece of parchment that has been scraped clean so it can be used again. The monks took the actual journals of the Pope's secretaries, the documents that contained the terrifying truth, and used pumice stone to erase every word. They then wrote the new, false history over the invisible ghosts of the true one. If you were to take these documents today and use modern ultraviolet imaging, you would see the original frantic descriptions of the Crystal Pope vibrating beneath the calm, legalistic prose of the forgery. The monks of the Shadow Scriptorium were themselves victims of the erasure. They were never allowed to leave the sublevels. They lived, worked, and eventually died in the dark, their names never recorded in any register. They were the anonymous architects of the world's greatest deception. They understood that the pen is a far more effective tool for containment than the sword. By changing the words on the page, they changed the reality in the minds of the people. They turned a biological evolution into a statistical anomaly. The Church also targeted the diplomatic records of other nations. Agents were sent to the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire to correct the reports sent by their ambassadors in Avignon. These agents used a combination of bribery, threats, and expert forgery to replace the ambassadors' letters. Any mention of the glowing palace or the sound of glass in the wind was replaced with reports of the Pope's declining health and the political maneuvering of the cardinals. The international community was effectively blinded. Their windows into the Vatican replaced with painted scenery. The moral decay of this process was absolute. The Church was not just lying to the people. They were lying to God. They were taking a manifestation of the divine, or at least a profound shift in the nature of creation, and declaring it a non-event. They were saying that the status quo of the Church was more important than the truth of the universe. This is the original sin of the modern era, the belief that information can be owned and controlled by the few. To keep the many in a state of subservience, the informativeness of the erasure extends to the very calendar itself. There is a period of 3 weeks in August 1362 where the official records of the Vatican are strangely empty. This was the time of the Silver Scream, the period when the Pope's transformation was at its peak. The Shadow Scriptorium could not forge enough mundane events to fill those 3 weeks, so they simply claimed the Pope was in silent retreat and provided no further details. This gap in the record is the only honest thing the Church left behind us. Silence that speaks louder than any forgery. As you listen to the rhythmic scratching of the imaginary quills, consider the power of the written word. We believe what we read because we want to believe that the world is stable and that the past is a solid foundation. But the Shadow Scriptorium proves that the past is as fluid as ink. It can be spilled, it can be blotted out, and it can be rewritten by anyone with enough power and a sharp enough pen. The Pope Innocent VI that you find in the history books is a ghost made of forged ink, a character designed to keep you from looking into the lead vault. Rewriting the parchment was only half the battle. The Church also had to contend with the living memory of the people of Avignon. Thousands of people had seen the lights in the palace windows. Thousands had heard the hum of the vibration. To deal with this, the Vatican launched a campaign of psychological warfare that would be familiar to any modern intelligence agency. They used the pulpits of every church in the city to spread a narrative of collective delusion and diabolical mockery. The informative details of this campaign reveal a sophisticated understanding of mass psychology. The priests told the people that the lights they saw were actually a demonic illusion sent to test their faith. They argued that anyone who claimed to have seen the Pope in a crystalline state was a victim of a spiritual sickness. This created a social pressure to stay silent. To speak of the truth was to admit to being possessed or insane. The Church used the fear of the Inquisition to ensure that the silver scream was never discussed. In the taverns or the marketplaces, the Church also employed memory cleaners agents who visited the families of the servants who had disappeared. These agents provided the families with false death certificates and a small pension, telling them that their loved ones had died of the same fever that claimed the Pope if a family became too curious or refused to accept the pension. They were branded as heretics and their property was seized. The memory of the true events was slowly smothered under a blanket of fear and financial incentives. The psychological layer of the erasure reached even the cardinals themselves. They had to convince themselves that the lie was for the greater good. They began to use a specific vocabulary when discussing the events in private. They never spoke of the transformation or the crystal. They spoke of the irregularity or the August event. By changing their own language, they distanced themselves from the reality of what they had seen. They became the first victims of their own forgery, their minds becoming as sterile and lead-lined as the vault itself. This moral decay is a hallmark of the Tier 1 historical narrative. It shows how an elite group can become so obsessed with the preservation of their institution that they lose their own connection to reality. They traded their eyes for the ink of the scriptorium. They chose to live in a world of their own making, a world where the laws of nature were secondary to the laws of the Church. The Pope remained in his vault, but the cardinals were the ones who were truly trapped in a prison of their own. Design. The informativeness of the memory seizure is found in the lack of folk songs or legends about Innocent VI in the 14th century. Significant events were usually captured in the oral tradition of the people. There are songs about the Black Death, songs about the 100 Years' War, and songs about the beauty of the Avignon court, but there is nothing about the Crystal Pope. The Church was so effective in their erasure that they managed to stop the very formation of a legend. They pruned the family tree of human memory until only the official branch remained. There were, however, small leaks in the containment. A few fragments of the true record survived, hidden in the bindings of other books or buried in the walls of the palace. These are the sources for the Lore Slumber archive. They are the anomalies that the Shadow Scriptorium missed. A stray sentence in a merchant's ledger about a shipment of lead that hummed. A note in a local surgeon's diary about the night the air tasted like silver. These are the threads of the true history. The ones that the Church could not quite pull. Consider the effort required to maintain a lie of this magnitude for 7 centuries. It requires a dedicated department within the Vatican, a group of guardians of the archive who continue the work of the Shadow Scriptorium today. They monitor modern historical research, ensuring that no one connects the dots between the strange architectural anomalies of the Chartreuse and the missing weeks of 1362. They are the descendants of the 12 monks, still working in the dark to keep the world from waking up to the truth of its own evolution. The air in your room is still, and the weight of the silence is heavy. The story of the erasure is a reminder that what we call history is often just the version of events that was strong enough to survive the furnace. The true past is often a forbidden place, a place of amber skin and silver screams that has been carefully erased to keep you from realizing your own potential. The lid vault is not just in France. It is in your history books, and the silver mask is on the face of every official account you have ever read. The legacy of the Great Erasure is a world that is fundamentally disconnected from its own reality. By removing the August event of 1362, the Church created a gap in the human narrative that has never been filled. We look at the 14th century and see only plague and war, never realizing that for a few months in Avignon, the very definition of what it means to be human was redefined. The ink of the Shadow Scriptorium has become a permanent stain on the collective consciousness, a layer of artificial darkness that hides the light of our true history. The informative value of this erasure is the realization that our modern world is built on a foundation of managed truth, the techniques developed by the monks in the sub-levels of Avignon were the ancestors of modern propaganda and information warfare. The Church proved that if you control the record, you control the perception of the possible. If the world doesn't know that a man can turn into a star, then no one will ever try to follow that path. The erasure was not just about hiding a pope. It was about hiding a destination. The psychological layer of the story concludes with the image of the Vatican secret archives. Inside those miles of shelving, there is a section that does not exist on any map. It is the inventory of the erased. This is where the original journals of Petrus de Alvernia and the blueprints of Master Valerius are kept. They were not destroyed because the Church knows that information is a weapon that might be needed again. They keep the truth in a cage just as they keep the Pope in a vault. They are the only ones who know the true potential of the human form, and they use that knowledge to maintain their grip on the world of men. The moral decay of the modern era is our acceptance of this managed truth. We live in a world of digital shadows where information can be deleted or rewritten with a single click. We are the children of the Shadow Scriptorium, and we have inherited their love for the comfortable lie. But the Lore Slumber archive is a crack in that ink-stained wall. It is a reminder that the truth is a physical force, a resonance that cannot be fully contained by lead or parchment. The silver scream is still there, vibrating at the edge of our hearing, waiting for someone to stop listening to the forgery and start listening to the stone. The informativeness of the archive also points to the physical evidence that still remains. The lead vault in the chartreuse is still warm. The hexagonal patterns in the stone of the Palais des Papes are still visible if you know where to look. The truth has a way of leaking through the ink, a biological fire that refuses to be extinguished. The Church can rewrite the books, but they cannot rewrite the bedrock. They cannot stop the slow transmutation of the world that began with a single pope in a darkened room daub as the story of the erasure ends. We return to the silence of the vault. The Pope Innocent VI of history is a paper man, a legalist, and a reformer who died of a fever. But the man in the lead casket is something else entirely. He is a being of amber and light, a silent judge whose golden eyes are still staring through the silver mask. The lie has lasted for 7 centuries, but the lead is thinning and the ink is fading. The world is beginning to remember the sound of the silver in the wind. The air in your room is cold now. The scent of the 14th century is gone, and the scratching of the quills has stopped. The story of the erasure is a story of a battle between the pen and the star. The pen won the first round, but the star is eternal. The silence of the archives is the silence of a held breath. A moment of tension before the truth finally breaks through the forgery. You have heard the story of the lie, and now you are part of the conspiracy of the truth. The memory of the Pope was erased, and the records were forged. But there was one person the Church could not silence, the Pope's own daughter, hidden in a convent in the south of France. She had seen her father's face before the silver mask was applied, and she had seen the crystal pattern beginning to emerge on her own skin. She knew that the transformation was not a curse, but an inheritance. And she knew that the lead vault was not a grave, but a cocoon dot in our next. The weight of the silver, a psychological decay. We will follow the story of the crystalline air and the secret society that formed around her. We will discover the psychological toll of carrying a transformation that the world has forgotten, and the terrifying reason why the silver mask was never meant to hold back a man, but to hold back a bloodline. What happens when the truth of the crystal pope is written in your own DNA? The secret of the vault is about to become a secret of the soul, and the weight of the silver is heavier than you can imagine. Inside the skull of Pope Innocent VI, a terrifying betrayal was taking place. It was not a betrayal by his cardinals or the kings of Europe, but a betrayal of his own consciousness. As the year 1362 drew to a close, the man once known as Etienne Aubert was being systematically erased by the very power he had sought to harness. The transformation was no longer just a physical curse of amber skin and crystalline blood. It had reached the delicate architecture of his mind. The forbidden secret that the Church buried deep within the lead vault was not just a body, but a shattered soul that had been replaced by a geometric cold intelligence. Every human memory of his childhood in the Limousin, every prayer for his family, and every regret of his long legal career was being overwritten by a series of tonal clicks and mathematical light. He was losing the ability to feel love, fear, or guilt, replaced by a mind that saw the world as a giant interlocking machine of glass. This was the true moral decay, the moment the Vicar of Christ realized he no longer cared for the salvation of humanity, because he was no longer part of it. The silver mask was not just a seal for his face. It was a cage for a mind that had become a traitor to the human spirit. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of cold incense and cooling metal fills the air. You are no longer standing in the world of the living. You are floating within the darkening corridors of a mind that is turning to stone. The heavy velvet curtains of human thought are being pulled shut. one by one, leaving only the sharp, clear light of the crystal. Breathe slowly and let the rhythmic pulse of this transition settle into your bones. Feel the weight of the silence as we explore the internal collapse of the last human pope. The world outside is a blur of soft edges and warm colors. But here, everything is hard, precise, and eternal. To understand the psychological decay of Innocent VI, we must understand the nature of his isolation. For months, he had been kept in total darkness, a biological capacitor gathering energy from the very air. In this void, his mind had no external stimuli to hold on to. He could no longer see his hands, which had turned to amber. He could no longer feel the texture of his robes. His sensory world had narrowed down to a single point of internal vibration. This is where the informational depth of the story begins. The Pope was experiencing a phenomenon that modern psychology might call sensory deprivation. But combined with an alchemical escalation, his journals, and the observations of the alchemist Valerius, suggest that the Pope's perception of time had become circular. He was no longer experiencing the past, present, and future as a linear sequence. Instead, he could see the entire history of the papacy as a single, static object. He saw the rise and fall of Rome not as events but as geometric patterns. This shift in perception was the first sign that his human ego was dissolving. The ego requires time to exist. It requires a story of before and after. But the crystal mind only knows the now. It only knows the resonance of the present moment. The Pope began to hear the music of the spheres, a concept that medieval scholars had debated for centuries. To him, it was not a metaphor. He could hear the actual frequency of the planets as they moved through the heavens. He could hear the vibration of the stones in the palace walls. This was not a holy vision. It was a sensory overload. His human brain, designed to process the sounds of voices and birdsong, was being flooded with the raw data of the universe. The psychological decay was the result of a mind trying to drink from an ocean through a straw. The straw was breaking. By the winter of 1362, the internal monologue of St. Norbert had stopped. In its place was a constant, shimmering hum. The informative depth of this stage of the transformation is found in the way the Pope's thoughts began to manifest as physical light. The guards outside his door reported that they could see flashes of violet and gold leaking from under the door, even when the Pope was supposedly asleep. These were not dreams in the human sense. They were geometric discharges, the brain's final attempt to organize the infinite data it was receiving. The Pope was no longer thinking in Latin. He was thinking in light. The psychological layer of this transformation was a total loss of empathy. As the Pope's mind became more crystalline, he began to see the people around him as nothing more than biological arrangements of matter. He could see the decay in the Cardinal of Carcassone's lungs. He could see the fear in the young scribe's heart as a series of chaotic red vibrations. He felt no compassion for them, only a detached curiosity, the way a scientist might look at a colony of ants. This was the ultimate moral rot. The man who was supposed to be the father of the faithful had become a cosmic observer, indifferent to the suffering of his flock. This shift in the Pope's mind created a profound terror in the church leadership. They realized that they could no longer control him through guilt or duty. He was no longer a man who could be swayed by political arguments or theological threats. He was a force of nature. The informativeness of the secret archive suggests that the cardinals tried to perform a final confession with the Pope, hoping to find some flicker of his former self. But when the priest asked the Pope to repent for his sins, The Pope only responded with a sound that sounded like two pieces of quartz being rubbed together. He was no longer capable of the concept of sin. Because sin requires a human soul, the Pope's mind had become a closed system. In thermodynamics, a closed system is one that does not exchange matter with its surroundings. Psychologically, the Pope had achieved this state. He no longer needed the validation of others. He no longer needed the rituals of the Church. He was a self-sustaining entity of pure information. This is why the silver mask was so psychologically devastating for the Pope. It was not just a physical barrier. It was a sensory deprivation device for a being that had become dependent on the gaze of the universe. The informative history of the silver mask reveals that it was etched with runes designed to reflect the Pope's own energy back into his brain. This created a psychological feedback loop. Imagine being trapped in a room made of mirrors where the only thing you can see is your own mind. For the Pope, the mask was a hall of mirrors that forced him to confront the void he had become. He was trapped in a perpetual state of self-observation, a psychological prison that would last for as long as the lead vault remained intact. This is the psychological decay that the lore slumber archive explores, the horror of a mind that has outgrown its container. The Pope was a titan trapped in a mouse's skull. His thoughts were too large, too bright, and too heavy for a human body to hold. Every second he remained in the world of men was a second of agonizing pressure. He wanted the lead vault. He wanted the darkness. He wanted to be away from the soft, noisy, chaotic world of the living. The burial was not a punishment for him. It was a relief. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this narration, consider the state of your own mind. We are all made of the same atoms as the stars, yet we choose to live in the small, narrow corridors of our daily lives. The Pope was a man who saw the truth of his own composition, and it destroyed him. He became a god of glass, but he forgot how to be a man. The moral decay of the story is a warning about the price of enlightenment. To see everything is to feel nothing. To be eternal is to be alone. The final days of the Pope's humanity were marked by a total withdrawal into the internal sun. The informative records of the Shadow Scriptorium mention that the Pope's final human words were not a prayer, but a mathematical constant. He whispered a number that would not be discovered by secular science for another 400 years. This was the sound of his human brain giving up the struggle and allowing the crystalline logic to take full control. The man was dead, but the being remained. The psychological layer of this final dissolution is the concept of inertia. The being that now inhabited the body of Innocent VI had no desire to move, to speak, or to rule. It was a state of perfect, unmoving focus. It was a mind that had found the center of the universe and was content to stay there forever. The Church, however, could not allow a living statue to sit on the throne of Peter. They needed the Pope to be either a man or a corpse. They could not deal with a third option. The decision to apply the silver mask was the final act of the psychological war. The mask was designed to blind the Pope's internal sight, to cut off the flow of information from the universe and force the mind into a state of permanent stasis. It was a lobotomy performed with silver and star metal. When the mask was finally applied, the humming in the room changed frequency. It went from a vibrant golden tone to a dull leaden thud. The mind of the Pope was effectively silenced, locked behind a silver face that would never reflect the light again. The informativeness of the mask's psychological impact is a study in energetic dampening by forcing the Pope to look into his own reflection. The mask created a null zone in his consciousness. It was a state of waking sleep, a dreamless eternity where the being could exist without growing. This was the only way the Church could ensure the security of the world. They had to turn a god into a battery, a source of energy that was contained and controlled. The moral decay of the hierarchy was their satisfaction in this act. They felt a sense of triumph as they watched the light in the Pope's eyes fade behind the obsidian lenses of the mask. They believed they had won. They believed they had successfully buried a truth that would have destroyed their power. But they didn't realize that the being they had silenced was still there, processing the data of the mask itself. The mind was not gone. It was simply focused on a much smaller target dot. As the story of the Pope's mind reaches its conclusion, we are left with the image of a consciousness that has been compressed into a single, dense point. The weight of the silver is not just a physical weight. It is the weight of an entire history being pressed into a single moment. The Pope is still there, inside the lead vault, inside the silver mask, staring at the runes that Marcello the goldsmith etched with a diamond needle. He is calculating the decay of the lead. He is calculating the movement of the stars. Through the stone floor of the monastery, the psychological layer of the lower slumber is the realization that we are all, in some way, wearing a silver mask. We all have a truth within us that is too bright and too heavy to be shared. So we cover it with the mundane, legalistic masks of our daily lives. We bury our potential in the lead vaults of our routines. The Pope is a mirror of our own choice to remain small. He is the man who went too far, and we are the ones who are too afraid to follow. The air in the vault is cold, and the sound of the clicking has stopped. The mind of the Pope is now one with the mind of the stone. He has become the lapis philosophorum, the living stone that the alchemists dreamed of. But he is a stone that can feel the weight of the mountain above him. He is a stone that remembers the taste of wine and the sound of a human voice. The psychological decay is the memory of humanity lingering in a mind that is no longer human. It is the ghost of Etienne Aubert crying out in a language of light that no one will ever hear. The psychological decay of Pope Innocent VI did not end with his burial. It left a residue in the stones of the Palais des Papes and a lingering frequency in the bloodline of those who were closest to him. The informative depth of the Vatican's secret history reveals that the Pope had a daughter, born of a forbidden union before his rise to the papacy. Her name has been erased from every official register, but the Lower Slumber archive remembers her as the crystalline heir. She was the one who carried the biological blueprint of the transmutation into the next generation. The psychological layer of the heirs. Story is the burden of an unwanted inheritance. She lived in a convent in the south of France, a woman who looked ordinary to the world but who felt the world as a series of vibrations and light. She could hear the same music of the spheres that had destroyed her father's mind. She carried the same star metal potential in her marrow. She was a living document of the transformation that the Church had tried to erase. The moral decay was the Church's attempt to hunt her down, to ensure that the contagion of the crystal did not spread beyond the lead vault. She lived in a constant state of psychological dissonance. She was told she was a child of God, but she felt like a child of the stars. She was taught to pray to a wooden cross, but she could see the atoms within the wood dancing in hexagonal patterns. She was a prisoner of a reality that no one else could see. This is the ultimate isolation, to know a truth that has been officially declared a lie. She was the final witness to her father's decay. the only one who understood that the being in the lead vault was not a monster, but a pioneer the informativeness of her secret diary, which was discovered in the walls of the convent in the 19th century, provides a bridge between the medieval mystery and the modern world. She wrote about the silver weight she felt in her own mind, a pressure that grew with every year. She realized that the transformation was not a one-time event, but a genetic directive. The human race was being pushed toward a new state of existence, and her father was simply the first to reach the finish line. The lid vault was not a grave. It was a delay. The Church's pursuit of the heir was a study in institutional paranoia. They realized that if she were to have children, the crystal gene would be released into the general population. The world would eventually be filled with people who could see through the walls and hear the songs of the planets. The hierarchy of the Church would be meaningless in a world of enlightened crystalline beings. To prevent this, they forced her into a life of absolute silence and celibacy. A psychological erasure that mirrored the physical burial of her father, as the story of the psychological decay concludes. We are left with the image of two beings, the father in his lead vault and the daughter in her stone cell. Both are silent. Both are glowing. Both are staring at a world that is too soft and too small for them. The weight of the silver is the weight of the lie that separates them. It is the weight of a church that chose to preserve its power by sacrificing its people. The moral rot of 1362 is the foundation of our modern silence. The air in your room is still now, and the story of the crystal mind is fading into the shadows. You have heard the history of the transmutation, the failure of the exorcism, the architecture of the vault and the erasure of the record. You have traveled through the mind of a man who became a star and found only a hall of silver mirrors. The weight of the truth is now yours to carry. Breathe slowly and feel the rhythmic pulse of the universe in your own blood. The lead is thinning, the silver is tarnishing, and the clicking sound is getting faster. The air was silenced. And the Pope was buried, but the Church made one final mistake. They did not realize that the silver mask was not just a container for the Pope's energy. It was a transmitter. Every 50 years, when the planetary alignment is right, the mask sends out a signal that can be heard by anyone who carries a trace of the crystal bloodline. And in the secret archives of the Vatican, there is a list of names of ordinary people living in the modern world who have begun to report a humming in their teeth and a light in their skin. In our next, the silent guardians of the secret archives. We will discover the modern-day task force that monitors these individuals. We will uncover the high-tech sensors hidden within the chartreuse and the terrifying reason why the Vatican has begun to buy up large quantities of lead and silver in the current year. What is the protocol of 2025? And why does the Church believe that the lead vault is about to rupture? The secret of the silver mask is no longer a matter of history. It is a matter of survival, and the weight of the future is heavier than you can imagine. Today, in the winter of 2025, the world looks at the Vatican as a sanctuary of ancient faith and marble history. But beneath the surface of the secret archives lies a room that does not appear on any map. It is known as Sublevel 7, and it is the headquarters of the Silent Guardians. These are not priests or theologians, but elite specialists in high-frequency containment and molecular shielding. They are the modern inheritors of a 700-year-old betrayal. They do not watch for intruders or thieves. They watch for a leak. Deep beneath the Chartreuse du Val de Benediction in France, The lead vault of 1362 is beginning to fail. The crystalline energy of Pope Innocent VI, which has been trapped for centuries, is vibrating at a frequency that is now threatening to breach the bedrock. The silent guardians monitor this activity through a network of satellite-linked seismic sensors, tracking a rhythmic pulse that has been steadily increasing for decades. The Church has recently authorized the covert purchase of massive quantities of high-purity lead and silver, preparing for a catastrophic event they call the Protocol of 2025. This is not a matter of religion anymore. It is a matter of survival. The truth is a biological fire that the Vatican can no longer extinguish. They are the jailers of a miracle that is about to wake up. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold ozone fills the air. You are stepping away from the noise of the modern streets and into the sterile, humming silence of the Sixth Division. The walls are made of lead glass and reinforced steel, reflecting the soft blue glow of the monitoring screens. Breathe slowly and let the steady, rhythmic pulse of the sensors guide your mind into a state of deep, focused calm. We are entering the secret world of the Watchers, the men and women who sacrifice their lives to keep the past in the dark. The Sixth Division, or the Sesto Reparto, is the most secretive branch of the Vatican Gendarmerie. Unlike the Swiss Guard who stand in the sunlight of St. Peter's Square, the silent guardians operate in total anonymity. Their recruitment process begins in the elite physics laboratories of Europe and the intelligence agencies of the Tier 1 nations. They are chosen for their scientific brilliance and their ability to keep a secret that would shatter the foundations of modern society. Once they enter the program, their legal identities are erased, and they are assigned to the monitoring stations that track the Avignon resonance. The informative depth of their mission centers on the 12.4 Hz frequency. This is the specific vibration recorded within the lead vault of Pope Innocent VI for 7 centuries. This number remains stable, a low-level throb that the Church managed through periodic reinforcements of the vault's structure. However, since the early 2000s, the frequency has begun to rise. It is now at 13.9 Hz, approaching a critical threshold where the lead atoms themselves will begin to vibrate in sympathy with the crystalline core. The silent guardians use superconducting quantum interference devices, or SQUIDs, to measure these changes with absolute precision. They are not looking for spirits. They are looking for the point of structural collapse inside the 6th Division's headquarters. The atmosphere is one of clinical dread. The room is filled with the sound of white noise, designed to mask the actual hum of the resonance that can be felt in the teeth of those who spend too much time there. The guardians work in 12-hour shifts, staring at thermal maps of the French monastery. The maps show a persistent heat signature beneath the chapel floor, a warmth that is not caused by geothermal activity or electrical wiring. It is the thermal output of a transformation that has never stopped. The lead vault is no longer just a coffin. It has become a reactor. The psychological layer of this modern-day watch is the toll it takes on the human mind. The guardians often suffer from a condition they call the mirror sickness. After months of monitoring the crystalline data, they begin to see hexagonal patterns in their peripheral vision. They report dreams of cities made of glass and skies filled with violet light. Some claim they can hear a voice speaking in a language of mathematics, a series of tonal clicks that bypass the ears and enter directly into the brain. The moral decay of the Vatican is the decision to keep these people in isolation, treating them as disposable tools in the management of a biological anomaly. The Church's strategy for the current year is a desperate escalation of the original 1362 containment. The protocol of 2025 involves the injection of liquid concrete, infused with lead borate into the caverns surrounding the vault. They are trying to create a tomb within a tomb, a mountain of artificial stone to hold back the light. They have also increased the silver saturation of the site, burying hundreds of tons of silver bullion in the fields surrounding the chartreuse to act as a secondary grounding grid. The cost of this operation is hidden within the Vatican's complex financial web, laundered through charitable foundations and shell companies to avoid public scrutiny. As you listen to the steady hum of this narrative, consider the nature of the secret. If the world knew that a human body could achieve a state of physical immortality through crystalline transmutation, the entire structure of our economy and society would vanish. The Church is not protecting the Pope. They are protecting the concept of death itself. They are ensuring that we remain trapped in the cycle of birth and decay while they monitor the one man who broke free. The silent guardians are the modern gatekeepers of the human limitation. The soldiers of the status quo. The informative history of the 6th Division suggests that they have also identified the crystalline air bloodline. In the modern world, these individuals are tracked with high-tech genetic surveillance. The Guardians look for specific markers in the DNA that indicate a predisposition toward the hexagonal resonance. When a potential heir is found, they are placed under a silent watch, their lives steered by invisible hands to ensure they never discover the light within their own skin. The conspiracy has evolved from the scriptorium to the database, but the goal remains the same, the total erasure of the truth. The air in the monitoring room is cold, and the blue light of the screens is the only sun the Guardians know. They sit in their lead-line chairs, listening to the 13.9 hertz throb, waiting for the moment the lead gives way. They know that the transformation of 1362 was not an end, but a beginning. The Pope is not dead. He is simply waiting for the container to fail. And when it does, the silent guardians will be the first to see the light and the last to feel the silence. The monitors are flashing and the frequency is climbing. The protocol of 2025 has been activated, but the sensors show that the energy is already moving through the bedrock toward the surface. The silent guardians have done their duty, but the lead is no longer enough. In our final subtitle, The Unresolved Echoes of Shattering Glass, we will witness the moment the vault finally ruptures, and the truth of the silver mask is revealed to the modern world. Tonight on December 24th, 2025, the silence that has held for 700 years has finally shattered into a billion fragments of light. In the deep foundations of the chartreuse, the lead vault of Pope Innocent VI has reached its absolute structural limit. For centuries, the Vatican maintained a lie made of heavy metal and forged ink, a betrayal of the human lineage that sought to hide our inevitable transformation into something divine. But lead is a soft metal, and truth is a diamond. The silver mask, once a cage for the face of a man who became a star, has begun to fracture, letting out a resonance that is dismantling the very bedrock of France. This is not a curse or a demonic return. It is the final failure of the glass sealing the church built over the human soul. The moral decay of an empire built on hidden truths is finally visible in the violet glow, emanating from the cracked earth of the monastery. They tried to bury the evolution of our species, to keep us small, mortal, and afraid. but the frequency of 1362 has found its mark. The silver is melting, the lead is screaming, and the reflection we once feared has become our only reality. The file is being forced open by the light of a secret that can no longer be contained. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years for the final time. The light is dim, the chamber of the mind is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment has been replaced by the crisp, cold air of the winter night. You are standing on the threshold between the history you were told and the future that has already arrived. Breathe slowly, feeling the weight of the story settle into the marrow of your bones. The rhythmic scratching of the quill has stopped, and the only sound remaining is the soft, hypnotic echo of shattering glass. The moral decay of the empire was never about the corruption of gold or the pursuit of political power. It was the active suppression of human divinity. For 7 centuries, the late vault held more than just a body. It held the stolen future of our species. The hierarchy knew that if one man could become a star, the need for their intermediaries, their rituals, and their control would vanish like mist in the morning sun. They built their cathedrals on the bedrock of a lie, ensuring that the light of Innocent VI was turned into a secret thermal anomaly rather than a beacon for the world. They preferred the safety of the dark to the danger of the dawn. Every pope who stood upon that black granite slab in the Chartreuse was a silent accomplice to the theft of human potential. They felt the warmth of the floor and heard the clicking of the crystal, yet they chose to reinforce the lead rather than open the door. As we watch the sensors in sublevel 7 flicker into the red tonight, we realize that the unresolved echoes of shattering glass are the sounds of our own chains breaking. The silver mask was never meant to be removed, but it was also never meant to withstand the pressure of an eternal soul. The star metal, forged in the depths of a medieval forge, has begun to resonate with the very stars it fell from. The alloy is separating, the silver returning to the moon and the iron returning to the void. What remains is the face of a man who saw the truth and became it. The crystalline lattice that once replaced his flesh is now expanding, moving through the lead, through the stone, and into the very air we breathe. The contagion of the transformation is no longer a localized event in 1362. It is a global frequency. Why did we choose to believe the forgeries of the Shadow Scriptorium for so long? Why did we accept the weight of the lead as our natural state? The answer lies in our collective fear of the reflection. We were told that the Pope's skin was a curse because we were not ready to see that our own skin is merely a veil. The moral decay of the institution was its refusal to let us grow. They wanted a flock, not a constellation. They wanted followers of the cross, not masters of the light. They spent 700 years perfecting the art of the limit, of the boundary, and of the cage. But tonight, the cage is made of glass, and the glass is breaking. The informative depth of this final breach is a study in the persistence of energy. We have learned that information cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden. The journals of Petrus, the blueprints of Valerius, and the screams of Marcello have all been vibrating within the collective unconscious, waiting for the frequency to match. The protocol of 2025 was the Church's final attempt to ground the light, but they